Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer, and this is Symmetry Live, aka Get Mormon Help. We are here today as a panel of providers from our group practice to specifically address some of our concerns in regards to an address that was given at BYU earlier this week by one of the church's apostles, Elder Holland. It has definitely been something that has shown up in our daily practice with every single one of us, as well as the 4 other providers that we were in contact with this morning. It has shown up obviously a lot on social media, and it has shown up in regards to a lot of professional discussions that are happening wider than just our group practice. So we feel like this is a very important thing to address. What we're hoping to do is to address it not so much from like a personal venting space necessarily. We've kind of done that through our own venues ourselves. But we do want to offer kind of a critique from a mental health, social health, even violence informed and trauma informed lens to the public, so that you might be more equipped to understand why people in the mental health profession might be concerned about the rhetoric and narratives that are being addressed to the faculty and staff at BYU, and the implications that obviously when a prophet of the Lord speaks in an ecclesiastical manner, it doesn't matter if you're just talking to teachers and faculty. Obviously, it affects the wider audience, the students, the families, and the membership at large. So in that vein, what we're planning to do is go through certain aspects of the talk that I will read, and then we'll have some discussion, sharing some of our concerns. And then hopefully at the end of going through that social science lens critique, we will offer maybe some ideas, some strategies, some tools, some ways to help in regards to whether or not you need to be focused on self-care, if this is affecting you personally, or if you're wanting to be a person who is involved in the community care and helping your ward or congregations or your families or your communities have better skills at knowing how to tend to, using LDS, speak, the Lord's flock. So given that, I want to just introduce the panel really quickly. I've got Michelle Peets, who is one of our therapists here in Salt Lake City area. We also have Colette Dalton, who also is a therapist here in the Salt Lake City area, and Jenny Elledge, who is a therapist who works out of Orlando, Florida. And Jenny will only be able to be with us probably about half the time today, but so glad that you're with us. Each one of these providers you can find more information at our website, symmetrysouls.com or getmormonhelp.com. Both will lead you there. All these providers offer both in-office and online help. Hopefully they can be part of your resource tools kit if you need, or any of the referrals or resources that they can offer. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to read the very first paragraph of Elder Holland's talk. He says, "Someone once told me that the young speak of the future because they have no past, while the elderly speak of the past because they have no future. Although it damages that little aphorism, I come to you as the veritable Ancient of Days to speak of the future of BYU, but a future anchored in our distinctive past. If I have worded that right, it means I can talk about anything I want." For the reason I point that out is I do think that he is making a point about generational conflict And I also think that he is using his authority and seniority as a way to, right from the get-go, in a sense, shut down criticism or different opinion because he's going to use his authority as somebody who's been around the longest. So
I don't know that I have anything to add. I think we will be talking quite a bit about abusive language and tactics. And from the very beginning, establishing authority can be a way to start the cycle. So that's just one thing to note.
In a very authoritarian role,
Right.
what I say goes.
Later, pretty quickly after that, he talks a little bit about his experiences, as a young boy and young man, and kind of how he started contemplating about BYU and how he saw it. And he refers to it as it must be the greatest university in the world, when he was only about 7 years old. That's kind of what he started thinking. And then again, kind of on the same point, he says, if anyone in this audience has been coming to this campus longer than that, which is, he says, about 69 years that he's been kind of involved with BYU, please come forward and give this talk. And then he says, otherwise, sit still and be patient. Elizabeth Taylor said to her 8 husbands, I won't be keeping you long. So I just want to point out that, the greatest university in the world is one of the, issues that I think we have and what might be considered a little bit of a narcissistic trait in LDS culture, where everything about us is the best and the brightest and the best, like there's nothing that can be better. So kind of setting up this standard that, if it comes from us, there's nothing that can offer anything better. Again, he talks about his authority with time, and therefore nobody else can really offer what he can offer. And then there's this little kind of just mocking quip about Elizabeth Taylor and her 8 husbands. So I've noticed in the last probably 3 to 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, that this is becoming a little bit of a habit from general authorities to be slightly belittling or even mocking of certain people in the media or certain situations or certain peoples in ways that are uncomfortable for me, especially since we have so many principles in regards to being careful with gossip and people's reputations. And we'll get more into that further, but any current thoughts on any of that?
Well, I also think it's interesting. Jana Reese wrote a good article about her reactions and thoughts. It was Elder Holland's BYU speeches at University of Yesteryear, if anyone wants to look that up. But I think it's very telling that to mock a woman in a situation where every single quote is from men. The only women he mentions in the talk are Elizabeth Taylor in this mocking quip, his mother, who helped show him the importance of BYU, and he actually uses feminine language to refer to BYU, saying her, she, which is also very interesting. And as Jana Reese talks about, further pedestalizing women that the church already has that tendency to do. So I think that was just very interesting, that instead of choosing a man to mock, because men have been divorced many times too, he chose Elizabeth Taylor. I thought that was interesting.
Any other thoughts? Michelle, you had put the notes of evocative language and grandiose language.
Yeah, in this next paragraph, he talks about how he has loved BYU for 3/4 of a century and how he owes, everything, like his service in the church, testimony of the church, his marriage, his beautiful children, and that it all kind of goes back to this profound decision he made to attend BYU. And so, yeah, extremely evocative language to put people in this place of, wow, look at this man who feels this tremendous emotion towards this university. I can trust him. And here, then they're put in that emotional space to be more receptive to anything he has to say. And so the problematic language that then follows can kind of be overlooked, because here's a man who is so loyal to this university that we are now speaking of and a part of.
And if you look at his video of giving this speech, you won't see it in the text, but 5 minutes prior to giving this speech, he kind of pontificates about, and is very emotional about a lot of different things. So it's already setting up that tone that this about, this sort of emotional encounter here.
And I think I'll mention at this point, there's, in a sense, something that we want people to be aware of as you're listening kind of to the whole talk, because we'll be stopping at so many junctures, is that there's quite a bit of study on abusive tactics in domestic violence situations, which are also family violence situations. It doesn't necessarily have to be husband and wife kind of status. There's often, the pattern that is seen is like building tension and even being kind of overly kind or overly, building your authority, building the tension, building the emotion, which is a lot of what you've been talking about. And then that all leads up, it kind of builds, and there's the incident of the abuse, whether that's verbal, physical, sexual. Then there's kind of like this reconciliatory, like softening, right, from that abusive state, and even going back to calm, just to repeat the whole cycle again. And there was an Instagram person, Colette, that you had mentioned, I forget her name now, that did a really good job of pointing out how this happens 3 times in this entire talk. And so what's happening in these kinds of situations is that the person with power is exerting a lot of authority, eliciting a lot of empathy, which then is confusing to the victim because the victim doesn't have as much authority and is now also kind of being pulled towards the abuser's emotions and is left oftentimes feeling guilty or confused or sad or responsible. And then when the abuse happens, it's very difficult then to say, hey, wait a minute, this wasn't okay. And even if the victim does say that, again, because the abuser has set it up in such a, I want to say, kind of powerful way, it's very easy to then say, well, but this wasn't abusive. This was all about my feelings and my best intents and all these wonderful things that I was trying to convey, which is also another aspect of that is gaslighting. So anybody want to talk about just that kind of overall structure that we can just put out right at the beginning as we go through some of these more specific details?
Sure.
I know, Michelle, you worked a lot with domestic violence in your past.
Yeah, I think so. To provide a definition of gaslighting is essentially making someone feel like it includes a lot of crazy making. You're intending to make someone feel like they can't trust their own intuition or their own reality. And so you can undermine their ability to make assessments or understand their own emotions, so that then the victim becomes dependent on the abuser for their definition of reality. And so we'll kind of talk about the different ways that Elder Holland does this in the talk, and how he uses just a lot of language that could confuse this issue. And we'll go through those, but essentially what can really happen that's really problematic for abusive situations is that an abuser is not completely malicious all the time. And so what Natasha was talking about with this kind of honeymoon-like phase where, there's this kindness, there are good feelings between the abuser and the abused. When the good times are good, they're really great, but the bad times are really bad. And so you see this experience of an abuser being extremely cruel, but then also extremely kind at times, which then muddies the water and confuses the victim and makes it really difficult for them to say this person is abusive. And what you see a lot of victims say over and over again is, well, but he's also really kind. He's a great father or, a great mother, things like that. And they'll come to the abuser's defense all the time because of this complication. And so we just want to make it clear that Elder Holland does have a tender heart in a lot of ways. Absolutely. And we've seen some really great things that he's done in the church, and he's spoken up about, mental health and lots of other things that people appreciate about him. But that does not negate highly problematic language like in this speech. So that's why we bring up that cycle of just being aware that it's a very complicated process and it is not something that's clear cut all the time.
And you mentioned the victims having a hard time calling out the abuser because of this. A lot of times, once the victim decides, I finally can call out, the next level is the family, right? So when a victim will say, hey, this is happening, I feel like there's something wrong, a lot of times the family or the community, the friends, will be like, no, that can't be happening because they are a good person, because they've done all these good things. And so this is a kind of a highly sociological problem we have in societies at large. And why abuse tends to be so prevalent is because we tend to take a black and white approach, right? If this person has done good things, that can't mean that they've done abusive things, right? Or if a person has done abusive things, it would always be bad. And, kind of we're very comfortable like demeaning strangers in the dark, right? that have, masks on and that hit you over the head with a bat. We're all fairly comfortable calling that out as a bad. But if that person who did that is also a person of note in your community and your family, it might be hard for you to agree that that actually happened. So those are fairly normal human tendencies that you see in any society, in any community.
Yeah. And there's been a lot of talk about the idea of intent versus impact. And I think that's important to bring up here as well, is that, so to your point, Natasha, people can look at someone like Jeffrey R. Holland and say, well, he is a good man. Look at all these things that he has done. And therefore, that's the one view of him that we're going to see. And we're going to ignore all the impact this has had on vulnerable populations, because at the end of the day, he is a good man. And here, what we're pushing for is saying, no, we do need to look at the impact. We do need to pay attention to who are these people that are hurting and are now afraid for their personal safety because of the words that he used here. And so we'll kind of revisit that throughout, but we can't just give him a free pass because of wanting to see him in a one-faceted way.
And to be clear, we're not here really to opine on Elder Holland's status as a good or bad person. We're just here to look at the words and the impact of the words that were said, regardless of who had said them. Any other thoughts about the abusive cycle or anything like that, Colette or Jenny?
No, I just did want to add, you mentioned I got some of that from on Instagram. If anyone wants to go check it out, it's at Maddie, MADIGOADE, and it's her abuse ed highlight, if anyone wanted to see what I looked at with that.
Yeah, she did a really good job of kind of calling out some of these verbiage that we'll be talking about today for sure. And we'll also put a link to a lot of these things that we're talking about once we're done today on the thread. We continue with the talk in regards to, again, building his authority, building his love. This is oftentimes, sometimes in the abuse cycle called the honeymoon phase. I have loved BYU for nearly 3/4 of a century. Only my service in and testimony of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, including my marriage and the beautiful children it has given us, have affected me as profoundly as has my decision to attend BYU, right? So again, like lofty and grandiose and very important language. And so testifying, I represent literally hundreds of thousands of other students who say the same thing. And so it's interesting how in that space, it feels like he's trying to put everybody who's attended BYU into the same lump. I'm a proud BYU alumni. Who else wants to claim that here today? I forget where everybody went. Oh, all of us. Okay, all 4 of us are proud BYU Cougars. Yay, Cougars. And yet, and I would agree, it was a very formative time of my life. It was a decision that affected my education, affected my social life, affected who I married and had children with, affected, a variety of things, as most universities do for a lot of people. BYU is not unique in that action. A lot of people would say that about the higher education institutions that they attend. And yet I will disagree with much of what he has said, even though both he and I can both attest that we love BYU, that we both have positive experiences there, and that we both have, loyalty to the institution per se. Does that make sense? So I see this as kind of like trying to lump everybody into one thing. And of course, if BYU matters to you, you would agree with me. And I'm here to say BYU does matter to me quite dearly, and I do not agree with you. Anybody want to talk about that?
Natasha, what awesome differentiation skills you're showing right here. which is a great adult task that we all get to learn. You and I can be different. We can love the same things, but you and I can also lovingly disagree.
But let's just talk a little bit about differentiation. That is something I talk to clients about a lot, about how culturally in Mormonism, we suck at it. Differentiation is a task developmentally that's encouraged in adolescence, but very much in high demand religions, you are discouraged from differentiating, of making sure that you stay in line, you stay in the group, you don't disagree with what's said, you don't go outside the bounds of what's been set. And so I'm glad you brought that up, Jenny. I think that is a very important skill to learn, but I do want to validate that it's not something that's taught very well in the church and in families that grow up very Orthodox.
And the only thing I would add is that, love and loyalty are very tied together in Mormonism, to the point of like, if you love me, you will follow me, you will listen to me and not question me. Whereas, with differentiation, it teaches you can really love somebody and respect someone and see things differently and speak up from your own perspective, and both can equally hold weight.
Yeah, and even the authority play, like I'm the oldest, I'm the wisest, nobody else can really have anything to say that would trump what I have to say because of my position, my stature. That is all kind of processes that lead to enmeshment, enmeshed cycles and circles, because then the test of connection, you can only stay connected if you're loyal to that person, versus the test of connection being able to be intimacy or relational. And that would allow for difference of opinion, but still have connection. So enmeshed systems don't really value intimacy, they value conformity, and they value loyalty. And so that does not really allow for individuation or for other people to have valid takes, right? And so, and that's true in family systems. And it's also true, of course, in ecclesiastical systems, because, obviously if your idea of God or things like that are very authoritarian, and therefore everybody has to conform in order to be deemed worthy or righteous, that in of itself is an enmeshed system as well, where there really isn't room for individuality or individual opinion that differs from what is touted as coming from, a higher power per se. So we have that duality here, right? Because he's speaking as to educators, but he's also speaking from an ecclesiastical perspective. And we see that dual kind of boundary cross a lot in this talk, which is one of the issues that we have in general in the Mormon church, whether it's bishops and their congregations, whether it's work and, your work life, but also with working with people in the church, right? So what if your bishop is your boss, but you're drinking coffee at work? So, there's all these kinds of interesting dual boundaries that we have in Mormonism, which is a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, and I want to specifically call out, you said he's speaking here to educators. I want to say he's speaking to educators as a board member of the institution. So that's, I think, even more of a dual relationship, because in my mind, he's talking as a board member to donors and to the staff of the institution. But he also, and we may talk about this more, calls upon his apostolic authority. And so that is a huge dual relationship there.
Exactly.
And very confusing about who is speaking when.
Yeah. And I felt this a lot throughout my disciplinary process and excommunication process. I was like, well, are you speaking to me as Sister Helfer? Like, am I being talked to as a congregant in your ward and congregation? As my, are you speaking to me as my stake president and my bishop? Or are you speaking to Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST, and you're calling my professionalism into question? And am I being encouraged to act differently professionally, right? So that was a huge aspect of what I was trying to bring attention to, and the positions that we are both as religious spiritual people in our faith communities versus professional people in our professions of choice, right, in our occupations, and the standards that we oftentimes have to adhere to in our professional ethics, whether it's biology, social science, the arts, engineering. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that later. But yeah, any further thoughts about any of that?
I just wanted to point out that on the topic of, sticking loyalty together with love, it was Elder Holland who actually said in a previous address in the last decade, the crowning characteristic of love is always loyalty. And that was something that he coined, and I know was a really popular phrase for quite a few people who really loved that idea that, okay, I can show the church that I love them through being completely loyal, which some people would then interpret as, unquestioning obedience. And so you see that where a lot of people are afraid to question, because then it creates this bigger question of, well, do you love me? And that's a scary thing to answer if people have the two mixed up together, to be able, and it makes it really difficult to try to explain, well, yes, I do love you, but I also disagree with you, is because of this rhetoric that we have in the church.
Natasha, maybe in the thread, we can put a link to the circumplex model that kind of highlights this in a visual way, this enmeshment that we're talking about, which is the idea of being in a system where that's very authoritarian, my way or the highway, and very high loyalty, lots of we identity, not a lot of room for I identity, me as a person separate from this we-ness of the system, which the research shows is an unbalanced way of living life, by the way.
Yeah, right. And mesh systems are not considered healthy systems. Neither are disengaged systems, right? So that's kind of like the two pendulum swings. You don't want to be so close that there's no room for an individual. You don't want to be so separate that there's no room for a community. So there's systems in the middle that adhere to a more balanced approach to systems, whether that's a church, a family, or even a workplace, right? So that they do better in those middle areas. So let's go forward. He goes on to, I again just want to point out like some of the honeymoon phase language, remembering that in a few paragraphs, he's going to be saying some pretty difficult things to this audience. But right now he's saying, thank you for what you do. Thank you for classes taught and meals served and grounds so well kept. Thank you for office hours and lab experiments and testimonies shared, gifts given to little people like me so we could grow up to be big people like you. Thank you for choosing to be at BYU because your choice affected our choice. And like Mr. Frost's poetic path, that has made all the difference. So he's going to berate this audience in a minute, but for right now, he's building them up, right? And so that is part of this abusive cycle that we are, asking you to consider.
There's also this false sense of humility that he's putting in here of like, he's just talked about this, like has established his authority as the person who's loved BYU the longest and that they need to sit and listen to him. And then here he's saying, oh, I'm this little person. You are the big people here. Thank you. And you see this as well is just kind of like taking the other approach as well, so as to not appear too grandiose or like he's thinking too much of himself. And so again, there's that complication of the characteristics of, oh, is he being, arrogant or is he being humble? And so you overlook it completely because it's just confusing.
That's correct, which is again what abusers will do. And that's part of gaslighting because it creates this false idea of sanity, of reality. It's like, oh, on the one hand, you're saying nobody else can speak because nobody else has your authority. On the other hand, oh, I helped you? Wait, what? What? How? And now I'm confused, right? So that confusion is one of the symptoms of a victim of gaslighting. So so he goes on and talks about a positive experience at BYU. And I want to say then at the same time, we start getting to some really problematic spaces here where he says, such are the experiences we hope to provide our students at BYU. So after he talks about all this, nice stuff, then imagine the pain that comes with a memo like this one I recently received. So here's this idealistic BYU experience that he just shared. And now we're going to contraindicate that with this memo that he received. And these are just a half dozen lines from a 2-page document. So whoever wrote this letter, he says, you should know that some people in the extended community are feeling abandoned and betrayed by BYU. It seems that some professors, at least the vocal ones in the media, are supporting ideas that many of us feel are contradictory to gospel principles, making it appear to be about like any other university our sons and daughters could have attended. Several parents have said they no longer want to send their children here or donate to the school. Please don't think I'm opposed to people thinking differently about policies and ideas, the writer continues. I'm not, but I would hope that BYU professors would be bridging those gaps between faith and intellect and would be sending out students that are ready to do the same in loving, intelligent, and articulate ways. Yet I fear that some faculty are not supportive of the church's doctrines and policies and choose to criticize them publicly. There are consequences to this. After having served a full-time mission and marrying her husband in the temple, a friend of mine recently left the church. In her graduation statement on a social media post, she credited such and such BYU program and its faculty with the radicalizing of her attitudes and the destruction of her faith, close quote. And then he says, fortunately, we don't get many of those letters, but this one isn't unique. Several of my colleagues get the same kind, with most of them ultimately being forwarded to poor President Worthen. Okay, who wants to take an initial stab at all of that?
Several examples of playing the victim, which again is classic abuser behavior and language, that if you can feel sorry for me, it's I'm the victim here. You're the one that's hurting me, not me being the one that's hurting you. Very, very common tactic. And it's so interesting to me, that some people in the extended community are feeling abandoned and betrayed by BYU. Playing the victim. There are plenty of people who are being abandoned and betrayed by BYU, not in the way that this letter writer is talking. Let's talk about the marginalized. Let's talk about the queer individuals, which we're going to get into later in this letter. Let's talk about all these people who are truly being abandoned and hurt and betrayed, instead of the donors and the people that are scared to send their children to a university because they'll then become too liberal.
Language of feeling abandoned and betrayed are pretty powerful and kind of indicative of maybe this enmeshment that we've been talking about, that they feel to this system. I guess we're talking about BYU here specifically, that they feel abandoned and betrayed. I'm supposed to be enmeshed with BYU. BYU is supposed to be just like me type of thing. I don't think that's necessarily the goal of the university.
Yeah, in theory, generally universities are where you're supposed to go and expand your worldview and gain critical thinking skills. And this seems to encourage that enmeshment and not differentiating.
Well, and I think we do need to call out our community in the fact that I don't know that we really value that aspect of going to get a higher education. I think many parents are actually very much in this kind of space where they want to send their blossoming adult children to spaces where they will not be challenged, where they will not be expected to grow or to have to rethink what their beliefs are, because there is a lot of fear and concern that there could be, exactly this, that somebody could come to a different conclusion about their testimony or about their ideas about spirituality or religion. And I think that there's a lot of, it's interesting because on the one hand, a religious institution has the right to have religious teachings. We see that in a lot of schools, Catholic schools, Notre Dame. We're not the only religious institution by any means, but we are mixing that with education, and religion and education at the core have kind of some very different mission goals, right? So religion is about theology and spirituality, and especially in high demand religions, it can be a lot about conformity, whereas education is about expansion. It's about bringing in lots of different opinions. It's about learning from a variety of different, sciences, right? Like social sciences and hard sciences. And so the goals are very different. And so higher learning institutions, I think, have that conflict at the core where they're trying to balance, can we offer like a world a world-renowned and accredited education, which would require diversity, at the same time that we want to protect our own worldview and provide it through our lens primarily.
I would add to that. So in this quote in the letter of like, please don't think I'm opposed to people thinking differently about policies and ideas. And then later they say, yet I fear that some faculty are not supportive of the church's doctrines and policies. And I think this is an ongoing problem in the church where people wonder, to what degree am I allowed to have different opinions? And I've heard this a lot in my office where people are going to Temple Recommend interviews and they get to that question about, do you affiliate with these groups that don't align with the church's views? And so many people do not know how to answer that question because we never really fully discuss that line. It's this really scary line. And some people are more comfortable with aligning themselves with advocacy groups that other people don't dare even come close to because this is such an ambiguous area. And so Elder Holland using this in his speech, I think, again, brings up that issue of, okay, faculty are allowed to kind of differ in their views, but to what extent and how expressive can they be?
Yeah, and the definition, for example, of doublespeak is language that reverses the meaning of words, right? So on the one hand, you start off with this particular space, but then like in the next sentence there's something else. So that completely contradicts what was just said. So it is confusing, right? On the one hand, of course I wouldn't want there to not be diversity at BYU. And at the same time, I really don't want diversity at BYU, right? And so, yeah.
And talk about the doublespeak. I don't think we addressed this already, of President Worthen announcing an Office of Belonging that BYU was creating right before Elder Holland then gives this talk. That's a huge example of doublespeak and definitely led to whiplash in my mind of, wait, you're saying we're creating this Office of Belonging, everyone belongs. I saw people celebrating like, yes, this is BYU's becoming even more safe for people on the margins. And then immediately after having this talk by Holland, it just kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, and then, that ultimately these letters are being forwarded to poor President Worthen. I don't know that if it's part of my job to do something, that then when I have to do that one thing, that I should be considered as a victim. So my understanding is that President Worthen is directly overseeing what's happening at BYU. So of course letters would go to President Worthen. That doesn't make him poor. That's part of his responsibility.
And a big part of playing the victim is that it then makes the person who is actually the victim feel extremely guilty for ever asserting themselves in any way or asking for what they need or want. And so it really shuts down the conversation because you're saying, oh, this poor man, he is overwhelmed. He cannot handle this input that we have for him. And so better to kind of take that mental and emotional load on ourselves so that we don't have to put him in more struggle than he already is. And so there's this really big kind of power play here of positioning President Worthen, who just made it abundantly clear, wants to do this and that this is their plan, but instead they're portraying him as somebody who is going to suffer from this. And so why would anyone want to write him after this and play into that struggle?
Yes. And then, of course, there's the issue that only one side of the equation is being represented here, because I know for a fact that BYU receives many letters from very concerned parents of LGBTQ plus students and other marginalized students that are not being represented in this talk. So it's kind of this unfair caricature of what's coming into the office.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, incredibly skewed. I would be curious if we were to tally how much of each is happening, but this is another example that it's really easy to pick and choose things that are said and done to support your argument and not present the whole picture of what's being said.
He continues, now most of what happens on this campus is wonderful. That is why I began as I did. So he, in a sense, is also agreeing that he started with a honeymoon phase of the talk. with, this is why I began as I did, but every so often we need a reminder of the challenge we constantly face here. So here comes this kind of castigation type of tone where now I'm going to put you in your place. And here's what I said on this subject 41 years ago, almost to the day when he was the president at BYU. I said then, and I say now, that if we are an extension of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, taking a significant amount of sacred tithes and other precious human resources, all of which might well be expended in other worthy causes, surely our integrity demands that our lives be absolutely consistent with and characteristic of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. At a university, there will always be healthy debate regarding a whole syllabus full of issues, but until we all come to the unity of the faith and have grown to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, our next best achievement will be to stay in harmony with the Lord's anointed, those whom he has designated to declare church doctrine, and to guide Brigham Young University as its trustees, which again are ecclesiastical leaders, not educational authorities. So herein lies, of course, the issue of who gets to decide what is the gospel and which gospel principles get to be, more, prominent in what it means to be a worthy or active member of our church, which is where, I think that many of the people who critique certain aspects of the church, me included, feel very much like we want to come to the unity of the faith, who very much want to measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, who definitely want to stay in harmony, with principles and teachings that are aligned with our conscience and our values and things that we believe are good. So, but again, the authority card is played because really the only people who get to decide how this harmony is going to happen are certain leaders and the board of trustees.
Well, and he, in settling kind of that debate, right, of what you're talking about, of who gets to establish this, he really here is establishing this level of benevolence of, we take a significant amount of sacred tithes, precious human resources, all of which might be expended in other worthy causes, but no, instead we do it here. You're welcome. And so there's kind of this, that's another abusive tactic, is really abusers are really good at establishing themselves as this very benevolent, very kind, generous, giving individual. So again, it's very difficult to kind of look at the ways that they're harming you because of all of the kindness that they shower on you.
And elaborating on that, speaking as someone who did work for the church my entire professional career, plus if you counted my years of employment at BYU before that, just as a student employee, you are reminded constantly about the sacred tithes and funds and consecrated funds that fund your ability to provide for yourself. And so huge guilting tactic as well about, remember, like, these are sacred funds that we are using to pay your paycheck, and you are here because of this. We know that BYU is heavily subsidized by tithing for tuition, for paychecks and everything. And so I imagine myself still being a church employee and hearing this. That is a huge layer of guilt, that my sacred tithes that people are paying that. And that's, layer of guilt there.
And of obligation. I mean, obligation and guilt often go hand in hand with abusers, and they'll use both. And so to think that I've had so much invested in me and therefore I must act a certain way.
Well, and there is a element of privilege here as well, right? Because it's not like LGBTQ plus members don't pay tithing. It's not like people of color don't pay tithing. It's not like, all kinds of, marginalized women pay tithing, right? And we are oppressed and don't have the same rights as other members, male members of the church. So again, we're only looking at what is considered the primary voice, which is, I think, the white Orthodox kind of member that you might find in, like, I don't know, Draper, Utah, right? Or something. But you're really kind of ignoring the tithes and the perspectives and the lived experience of so many other people who still fall under this umbrella. So one of the things that is constantly upsetting to me is that we talk to church people as we know who they are. right? Like, so of course, everybody must fall under this category. Everybody must be benefited by this particular way of doing things. And in that entirety, you're ignoring exactly the populations that need us the most to stand for them and advocate for them, and for us to actually be curious and be listening to them. So that this perpetuates this kind of abuse of minorities within our own community system. Okay, so moving on, he quotes Russell M. Nelson: "With the church growing more rapidly in the less prosperous countries, we must conserve sacred funds more carefully than ever before. At BYU, we must ally ourselves even more closely with the work of our Heavenly Father. A college education for our people is a sacred responsibility, but it is not essential for eternal life." Well, that is very confusing to me, quite frankly. Those are three very, I'm not really sure how they all tie together. So we start off by saying, I'm not sure what the implication is. So because less prosperous countries are growing more rapidly, we must conserve sacred funds. Therefore, because they're going to need our help. That's problematic because we know a lot of the financial things that are happening in the church, and we know that the amounts of monies that we have stored, and we also know that the amount of help going to underdeveloped countries is not very significant compared to the funds that we have stored. So I'm not really sure what that's about. Anytime you're using a word that has been that's typically being used in a certain societal context, like the word ally these days primarily is, I mean, it's a very interesting and complex world in social justice circles. So then to use that same word as a way to ally ourselves with Heavenly Father, which again is their ideas of how Heavenly Father wants us to act. And then on top of it, to say a college education is important, but not necessary for eternal life. I guess that's true. I mean, I guess, nobody has to have a formal education to be a worthy or good or moral person, obviously. But what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Because we are talking about an institution of higher learning where people are trying to better their lives, where we are trying to get educated. We actually do have doctrinal concepts about intelligence being an important thing to acquire in this life. And people are trying to provide for families. And we know that people are better able to do that with college education. So there's a lot, there's three sentences that seem very discombobulated to me. What are your thoughts?
I really like how Jenny pointed out, so we'll represent her here since she's no longer with us, that this can really seem like a veiled threat. And we'll go into the next paragraph because I think it kind of provides some context for that as well. But like you said, Natasha, they seem to be these three kind of disconnected sentences that you have to kind of piece together. What is he saying here? He's saying, we may not have as much money to kind of keep doing this, like money is an issue. So he's kind of hinting at that. And then he's saying, this isn't necessary for eternal life. So right now we're prioritizing it, but it's not essential. And so it can kind of create a lot of questions of like, is he saying that potentially in the future, the church is not going to prioritize education, but that we're lucky to have it right now? Because that's where my mind went when I saw this. And so I think veiled threat is a perfect term for it because it's not explicit. We don't know if that's exactly what he's saying, but at least for me, I'm left with kind of feeling a little fearful when I read this.
Yeah, so let's go to the next paragraph, which says, "A statement like that gets my attention." Oh, me too. Particularly because just a short time later, President Nelson chairs our board, holds our purse strings, and has the final yay or nay on every proposal we make, from a new research lab to more undergrad study space, to approving a new pickup for the physical facility staff. So yeah, it's kind of saying these things that matter in your departments are kind of being controlled by people who hold the purse strings. And it's fairly distasteful for me to be like, if we're going to talk about money, let's talk about money. If we're going to talk about spirituality, let's talk about spirituality. It's fairly distasteful to me that we're kind of conflating the two, like the monies that you need to run your departments well are now going to be, in essence, possibly, like you're saying, threatened if you don't comply with the spirituality that we're going to impose.
Well, and he goes on, like in the next sentence, he says, Russell M. Nelson is very, very good at listening to us. We who sit with him every day have learned the value of listening carefully to him. And so there's kind of this establishment of authority, and then he's really intimidating people in an intense way by saying, look at all this access to power that we have. We basically can make or break your lives based off, what the prophet decides for the future of this university. He listens to us and we listen to him. So you all better listen to me.
And following with the authority. So 3 years later, Elder Dallin H. Oakes, not then, but soon to be in the first presidency, where he would sit only one chair, one heartbeat, again, like provocative language, right? Like really getting the language away from the same position President Nelson now has. And he quoted Elder Neal A. Maxwell. So this is this kind of authority roulette type of power. Do they always make sure that they give authority to each other to keep us, again, in that place? So just like he said, you can't really trump me. Well, you can't trump President Nelson. Elder Oakes is only one step away. Now he's quoting Maxwell. So all of these are the people that have authority and direction over anything that you would have to add to this conversation. And in fact, we're not really interested in having a conversation because you can't say anything that would be of worth because we are the authority.
And one of the scariest parts to me about abusive language is the use of intimidation, which is often way worse than the actual acute incident when someone becomes violent, like the actual violent act itself. A lot of people live in psychological intensity and that fear, and they'll report that not knowing if their partner or whoever is going to hit them is far more damaging than the actual incident itself of the violence. And so this to me feels very kind of the highest level of abuse right here is kind of using that intimidation and using the ambiguity of the future and where BYU can go if people don't fall into line. That's one of the most problematic parts of this speech.
The next part that we're going to talk about, I do kind of just want to preface with that I'm very uncomfortable reading this out loud, because this next part is absolutely incendiary language and can incite violence. And I'm not saying that to be over dramatic. There's very much research to show that words matter. And especially in the current times that we are living in with so much problems in regards to this kind of an issue, I'm very uncomfortable even just reading this out loud. And I guess it's almost a little bit of a trigger warning, if you want to call it that. If you want to step away from this particular part of the talk, that's fine. So he goes on to quote this quote of Elder Maxwell. He says, quote, "In a way, Latter-day Saints scholars at BYU and elsewhere are a little bit like the builders of the temple in Nauvoo, who worked with a trowel in one hand and a musket in the other. Today, scholars building the temple of learning must also pause on occasion to defend the kingdom. I personally think," Elder Maxwell went on to say, "this is one of the reasons the Lord established and maintains this university. The dual role of builder and defender is unique and ongoing. I am grateful we have scholars today who can handle, as it were, both trowels and muskets." Then Elder Oakes said challengingly, quote, "I would like to hear a little more musket fire from this temple of learning," unquote. He said this in a way that could have applied to a host of topics in various departments, but the one he specifically mentioned was the doctrine of the family and defending marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Little did he know that while many would hear his appeal, especially the School of Family Life, who moved quickly and visibly to assist, some others fired their muskets all right, but unfortunately didn't always aim at those hostile to the church. A couple of stray rounds even went north of the point of the mountain. I'm just going to pause there for a minute. So first of all, I mean, if we're going to look at the historical context of this, with people building a building in hostile territory, or maybe they were in danger of people firing on them, with their lives, maybe it made sense to have a gun at your side in the frontiers of the West and the historical context of that space. To now make that a direct metaphor to a minority population that we need to be holding a musket against, I don't really know that I have the words, quite frankly, emotionally or professionally, to even begin to address this. So it's your cue to take over.
I think, to elaborate on that, yes, it does make sense historically. It does not make sense now. Again, I think this is language that paints the church as the victim instead of a potential abuser, saying the world is attacking what we believe a family unit is and we need to stand and defend, instead of the church being the one that's attacking families that fit outside the traditional two-parent, male, female, 2.5 children home. We know that families are way more diverse than that. And to use such visceral language of using a gun when the week prior to this address given, a lesbian newlywed couple, been married 4 months, was found dead in Moab while camping. How tone deaf can this be? To use language of guns and violence when we are in an era of people being killed daily by guns, gun violence. When we, as a church, even talk about putting down guns and promoting peace, to say, let's pick up guns to defend, when we are in the wake of a riot at the Capitol back in January, where people felt the need to defend what they saw as right with violence, tone deaf doesn't even begin to describe it.
We had a comment yesterday with someone that we were talking to who identifies as LGBTQ+, saying that after this speech was made, that they saw many comments of their family members saying on social media, "I'm happy to take up my musket," and making jokes about guns. And so I think this is problematic because of what Colette just mentioned of our context right now, but also that while we would hope that Jeffrey R. Holland was just speaking metaphorically and that everyone would understand it as a metaphorical thing, that there are many, many people out there who will not understand it as such, who will take it literally. And what that creates is an environment that is so unsafe for LGBTQ plus and other minority populations. And so when you have language that is explicitly violent, you're going to see violence ensue. And so there were so many other metaphors that he could have used, so many, to incite some kind of passionate support for what he was looking for, because we know that that's what he wants here, is he wants to incite some kind of passionate support. But why not do that with some type of metaphor that isn't specifically violent, not to mention lethal? Like, guns ultimately kill people. They can wound people, but they also kill people. And so this is like as violent and as scary of a metaphor as he could have chosen.
Yes, why use guns? Guns, like, that just really spoke to me, Michelle. Guns kill people. And there was something going around on social media as well that bad theology kills. And that's what this is, that people defending the church, people speaking against the church isn't going to kill the church. But the way that this language is being used could very easily kill people.
This is a man speaking on a college campus, like a college campus. We already have a history of problematic violence on college campuses. This is not the way to go.
There's so much social context here that is just mind-boggling to me. The discussions we're having about gun violence in our country, mass shootings, many of them religiously motivated. Let's think about the global community, what's happening in Afghanistan right now as we speak. Again, with very religiously motivated people thinking that it's okay to take their own lives and take other people's lives in the name of their gods. And then not to mention the particular population that he's addressing, which we know are at much higher levels of risk for suicide and for mental health issues, and not just from self-inflicted, but are at much higher levels of risk from hate crimes. We have a horrific history of hate crimes against trans women, against gay and lesbian couples and individuals in this country, against intersex people. It's so irresponsible, it does not even begin to express my distress at this particular language. And this is just, you don't even need to be a mental health professional. This is just common sense. Not to mention that we actually have quite a bit of research to show that the last administration run under Trump, with so much of his incendiary language, has doubled domestic terrorism in the United States just in the last 5 to 6 years. People take this seriously. And we should know this, especially in a high demand religion. Yes, we have many mainstream Mormons who would never even dream of doing anything, problematic with a statement like this. We have many Orthodox Mormons. We have many mentally ill Mormons. We have many Mormons who take their ideas of loyalty, are basically like, having bunkers of ammunition. We know these statistics, and it is highly problematic to me that this language would have been used against such a vulnerable population. And not just a population who is out there, a population that is our children, a population that is in the university, a population that probably is in this, not probably, is in this faculty. And I can't even imagine if I would have been a queer and feeling the tension as it was building, and wondering and knowing probably which of my colleagues would be as supportive of me and which would not, and I'd actually be in danger from. I can't even imagine what it would be like to sit there through this kind of discussion that is just irresponsible and has humongous implications. This is not, for people to say, oh, well, you know what he means, or that's not literal. No, they're not just empty rhetoric. We have the research to show that we as human beings, we influence each other greatly. If I smile, you're more likely to smile. We influence each other at that level. And if you have a person who is claiming to be a spokesperson of God, who has tremendous influence, you cannot take the position of, oh, this really isn't that big of a deal.
It's a huge deal. I'm thinking of being a parent of like college-age children, one who's now attending a rather large university just like miles down the road. If someone from the school board gave this type of address at that university, no way would that fly. And if that did happen, as a parent, I would be extremely concerned about sending any of my children to this university that would even condone this type of speech to begin with. It's extremely problematic. And I'm concerned not only for the LGBTQ student and potentially their staff, but just the population at large. Mm-hmm. I mean, classes start next week, right? I'm kind of a little bit concerned. I'm concerned about what campus life is going to be like for the population at large. What's happening here? It doesn't invoke any feelings of safety here.
No. And we know that mass shootings don't just target the particular person that has been discriminated against. Plenty of people get caught up in a mass shooting that are, I agree. I can't, I hope that it's coming across. I can't even really, quite frankly, find the words, okay, for how horrible this is. And I'll say this at the end again, but I hope that most parents at BYU will do exactly what you're saying. I hope that poor Brother Worthlin will get an inundation of letters decrying this kind of language being not only spoken to the staff and faculty, but then shown on LDS Newsroom for anybody to see. This even goes beyond Elder Holland's responsibility. This now becomes a church responsibility, because even people would say, well, that's just one person. No, but it's on the LDS Newsroom. These talks, we know, are usually vetted. This probably was already seen ahead of time before this talk was even given. So the responsibility now is communal. It's not just Holland's responsibility. It's a communal responsibility to not have talks in 2021 in such a volatile political and global climate to be inciting violence at the Lord's University. So to continue, he says, again, he just said something pretty horrific. So what's the next thing? Let's think about that abuse cycle. My beloved brothers and sisters, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Boy, I would agree with that. So why are we consistently dividing against an entire population of our community? Why are we doing that? So again, he's using a principle that is correct and using it against the actual ways that it could actually be helpful. As long as we're at war with an entire minority population in a community, which we know is not of their doing, it's like being at war with race or with ethnicity or with anything, all these qualifications, disabilities, all these qualifications that are protected by the government itself, sexual orientation being one of them. Whenever you're at war with something like that, you will be divided. You can't help but be divided. So how can he use a principle that is actually supposed to help us become undivided to continue to divide us? That's another form of gaslighting, another form of crazy making. Because I will go to my grave pleading that this institution not only stands, but stands unquestionably committed. So again, the language is very black and white to its unique academic mission and to the church that sponsors it. We hope it isn't a surprise to you. Okay, this is another one. So let's just pause here for a minute.
Yeah, can I throw something in real quick before we move too far from it? Is what you were talking about with bringing up this house divided. It's a very, very clever thing that he's doing here in terms of blaming people for creating this division. That it's like, you guys keep bringing up these issues and look at all this division that you're creating, and therefore you're making this house lose its power because of all the disunity. Look what you're doing, rather than acknowledging we have different opinions. And maybe all of the voices need to be heard, and maybe we need to sit in that discomfort. Instead, when we can place blame, then we can end the conversation again, and we can silence those voices, because unity is destroying this organization. And how dare you? That's right. Which again goes against a lot of scriptural teachings, right? Where it says the arm has a purpose, and the eye has a purpose, and the leg has a purpose. And so the house united has a lot of different pieces of moving parts that bring different aspects of health and wellness to the overall system. So we're ignoring even some of our best doctrinal stuff as usual. I think we ignore our best doctrinal stuff. But I'm going to read a few comments that are coming in. Tammy Johnson Ellis says, at the entrance to BYU is the sign, the world is our campus. And we'll actually be talking about global implications a little bit more, but that's true. The world is our campus. And people have joked for years and changed it to the campus is our world. I'm afraid there is some truth to that joke. Charles Amador says, what's crazy is that there are many who are really loving Holland's incendiary talk and see no problem with it. Were they even listening to the same thing? So this is where we really do have to look at our community at large and why there's so many that don't think that there's any problems with this talk, whereas so many are really up in arms and considering even their testimonies and leaving the church over this talk, right? So there's a huge variety of reaction to this. Jennifer Barnett Davis says, I teach my education students to focus on Maslow before Bloom's. For an educational institution to prioritize an idea over the safety of the students is horrible. It immediately created an unsafe environment for LGBTQ students at BYU. It's antithetical to an educator's mandate.
This is part of like what happened with me professionally, right? So what I'm taught to do professionally was so upsetting to the church that they had to kick me out. But what educators are taught to do ethically and their regulations and their ethical guidelines and their professional statutes and, you know, how they're supposed to conduct themselves basically is now also they're being told, no, you can't be an ethical educator. You can't be an inclusive educator. You can't advocate for the minorities in your classrooms. And Christina Johnson-Stroggen says, glad to see you again, Colette. An important discussion. Thank you for having it. Cecilia Weber says, have you seen Tom Christopherner's thoughtful post on his Facebook page? I have read through that. That's, you know, there's lots of thoughtful writings on lots of people's social media. As usual, most things have problems with them and most of the things have really good things. So I would just encourage people to look at a variety and don't just look at your own social media. Don't get caught in your own echo chamber. Look at people who may have a different opinion. And she continues, thanks for doing this and helping us understand why Holland's speech is so problematic. Okay, so we're going to continue now with another part that it's extremely distressing to me. He continues, we hope it isn't a surprise to you that your trustees are not deaf or blind to the feelings that swirl around marriage and the whole same-sex topic on campus. I and many of my brethren have spent more time and shed more tears on this subject than we could ever adequately convey to you this morning or any morning. We have spent hours discussing what the doctrine of the church can and cannot provide the individuals and families struggling over this difficult issue. So it is with scar tissue of our own that we are trying to avoid, and hope all will try to avoid, language, symbols, and situations that are more divisive than unifying at the very time we want to show love for all of God's children.
Ouch.
I have sat with abusive parents in my room. I have sat with abusive parents. I've seen bruises on children and adolescents. And I have had those parents tell me very similar things. But I love this child. I'm up at night wondering how I can do better as a parent. I only beat them because I cannot control them. And it's for their own good. And I cannot, yes, there is a burn scar, but I couldn't not address what they were doing with their behavior. And it is probably the most difficult time to stay fairly professional in those spaces with those people, as it is obviously very difficult for me to have any respect for anything to do with this statement. Again, not only is he asking us to have empathy for their dilemma when they are not the ones that are being harmed. On top of it, he is again using language, scar tissue that has incredibly complex, difficult, agonizing implications in this community, both from attempted suicide, completed suicide, and self-harm that is oftentimes the result of non-affirming, horrific communities that continue to abuse people who cannot change who they naturally are.
As a queer person myself, it really, really hurt me to read him that he said, I and many of my brethren have spent more time and shed more tears on this subject than we could ever adequately convey to you this morning or any morning. We spent hours discussing what the doctrine of the church can and cannot provide. That is so incredibly invalidating to me. I don't think they can comprehend on any level the immense pain that I've been through as a queer individual because of what the church can and cannot provide in his language. I don't think he can comprehend the tears that have been shed by me, by other queer individuals. That's another tactic of playing the victim. We're the ones who are in so much pain over this. And maybe I'm wrong, but I personally believe, and what I hold on to is that the church is wrong on this and that there is further revelation and light and knowledge that will come if they're open to it. And so to say we've shed so many tears and the church, our hands are tied. We cannot do more to help individuals when people are literally dying because of things the church can and cannot do or will not do. I don't have words. It just hurts beyond what I can convey.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Colette. Again, hours of crying. We're talking about lifetimes. We're talking about people crying for the rest of their lives because they lost their child or their sibling. And then it's so condescending just to the gospel. Oh, so 12 men crying for a few hours and they haven't been able to find possibilities within the doctrine, the expansive doctrine of a God that we barely understand. That Implies that you think you know a whole lot about things that are way above your pay grade. It ignores shifts and changes that we have made on a variety of topics that also at one point white, privileged, old, limited men could not see a way forward for minorities.
And like you said, it ignores the possibilities that are already there. Maybe we'll include this in notes, but Tabernacles of Clay by Taylor Petrie and Queer Mormon Theology by Blair Osler shows how easily LGBTQIA+ individuals can fit, and they already do. And so to be systematically excluded because a group of men don't see the possibilities and aren't asking for revelation and just saying, sorry, this is the family and we must defend it, when their idea of the family is the creation of the 1950s. Again, I don't have words.
I'm really glad that you're here to speak to this. I so wish, like Natasha said earlier, that all of these people he's speaking about could have a representation. Like he's just speaking about them out of his own perspective.
Well, and nothing. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, no, go on.
Just the phrase that I think a lot of queer people have adopted from the disability community, the nothing about us without us. Mm-hmm. And there isn't, like, we know that people have gone to the Brethren to talk about these issues, but I still don't think they're being heard. And to, again, just be excluded, to like bear witness to our pain of trying to make this work. Countless clients this week have brought up how much this hurt them. I've had multiple clients, friends, peers crying in my office over this, on the phone over this. I know I've shed tears over this just this week. And I feel like I'm in a generally pretty good place, that I'm no longer suicidal because of this stuff. But this is a setback. This is hard. How many more lives have to be lost before things can change? I didn't mean to interrupt you, Michelle. I'm obviously very close to this subject and have lots of thoughts and feelings.
Of course. And actually, you're quite contained and compassionate. I'm usually the one that gets feisty and furious.
It is interesting. I feel like culturally, anger isn't an emotion we're told is okay. And actually feeling angry this week has been very interesting for me. And so I know I am contained, but this also isn't. This is out of what I would normally do because we are so socialized to not say certain things and not express certain emotions. So this has been a very interesting week that way.
Well, and it's basically implying that there is no room for the LGBTQ plus community in the plan of happiness. I mean, we have spent hours of what the church can and cannot provide. So, and you're right, that without the voices of anyone that would have, and I guess, as they say that, you know, Colette, and I know people personally who have sat actually with Elder Holland and other apostles in the church. And when I think about my own journey and the many ways I've had to shift, growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and the horrible discriminatory ideas I had, in my earlier part of life, what changed me were the stories. What changed me, it wasn't some logical explanation. No, what changed me were the tears, were the stories, were the people in my office that forced me to look at a reality that was not mine. And in that space, I had to sit with that cognitive dissonance, and I had to sit with my own discomfort. And it is what I give honor, and I'm just so grateful that I was able to shift because they softened my heart and my spirit. And so for me to have them, this almost like for me condemns them even further, because I know that maybe they haven't done it as often as I have. They don't do it on a daily basis as a counselor, but they've done it countless times. They have sat with people who are suicidal. They have sat with families who have lost people to suicide. They have sat with people who are incredibly distraught over the quality and abilities to even see how life can move forward. And I don't see a humbling. I don't see a softening of heart. I don't see the basic things that we are, explicitly told are important in gospel living and spiritual living happening to the elders of this church.
And I think my question through all of this is, why did not all operations of the church stop when the first person died? Like that, President Hinckley once said that a crisis somewhere is a crisis for everyone, everywhere. And he was talking about humanitarian aid. But I think that's such a great idea of, if there is a crisis here, which one death is, then why did not everything cease and all attention focus on that one thing? And you look at this line here where he talks about the scar tissue, and he says, and so it is with scar tissue of our own that we are trying to avoid, and hope all will try to avoid, language, symbols, and situations that are more divisive than unifying. And I feel like that's kind of their stance right now, is we're trying to avoid these things from happening, rather than the language of, we are going to do everything it takes to make sure that this no longer happens, that this ceases now. And so it's so sad to me to see how uncommitted they are to this crisis that we're in.
Well, and you had mentioned too, Michelle, that in that same sentence, he's saying, don't do what I just did.
Yeah.
Don't use language, that would be devices or symbols. And he's saying scar tissue, which is an incredibly disastrous symbology and visualization to bring to the table in this particular setting, especially on them. On what's scar tissue? Show me your scars, because I've seen the scars. I've seen them. I saw them last night on several people who were sitting around our circle visually. Don't use ridiculous language and then tell us to avoid symbols of division. It's just incredibly hypocrisy, and just falls into a lot of these fallacies, right, that you can find in social science that are termed, they have names. These are things that are actual things that people do that have names to them. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, the idea of unification here, we're using the word unifying, but I don't think Elder Holland and I are agreed on what unifying means here, right? So the idea of diversity and differences, I'm different than you, you are different than me, we can still stay connected. That differentiation is feeling threatening here at the campus.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I looked up some evidence-based stuff on diversity training, which there's a lot of great evidence-based research on how diversity training actually helps with unification. So I'm just going to read a few bullet points from this article. It says, diversity training strongly enhances people's knowledge about other groups. It also affects people's beliefs and how they behave towards others. But this effect fades over time. So guess what needs to happen? Continual diversity training. Mm-hmm. And not just training, but implementing other diversity-related initiatives simultaneously with the training. amplifies its effects on beliefs and behaviors and helps them last in time. And diversity training works better if it focuses on building both awareness about biases and skills for interaction. This is the most non-diverse training talk and least trauma-informed talk at a center for higher education that I could imagine. And given where we're at in the education of trauma-informed care and diversity training, which already is not as good as it should be, and it's here and we're like way down here, how can that even be acceptable? How can we give our students, our children, over to an institution that doesn't even meet any level of trauma-informed or diversity training capability? And what implications does that have for their ongoing workspaces and ongoing community work? And how are these students that are being trained in this center going to be able to adequately and effectively move into a workspace that is neons ahead of them? And we'll get to more of that too, because he talks about accreditation. And I think that there's huge implications here for what a BYU degree is going to be of value if we continue down this road just in the next few years, because companies are not going to have this. Companies are going to be like, that's the last place we want to recruit. Okay, the next piece is also incredibly difficult for me to read because it just feels like just by reading it, it feels like I'm complicit in gossip. And I hate gossip. And I hate anytime anybody tries to belittle or disqualify or discredit anybody's reputation. So he specifically calls out a particular past student at BYU. So he says, if a student commandeers a graduation podium intended to represent everyone getting diplomas in order to announce his personal sexual orientation, what might another speaker feel free to announce the next year until eventually anything goes? What might commencement come to mean or not mean if we push individual license over institutional dignity for very long? Do we simply end up with more divisiveness in our culture than we already have, and we already have too much everywhere? There's like 20 different concepts that we could talk about just in these 4 sentences, but I'll let you go first.
Again, we have the whole divisiveness is he's speaking as the individual over the institution. I think that just kind of summarizes where he's coming from. He's wanting everyone to be enmeshed with him. He's wanting to have authority over everything. He's wanting everyone to be in agreement with him. And the individual, whether you're a student, whether you're a professor, whether you're a staff at BYU, won't be tolerated, according to him.
I just go along with you, Natasha, how to point out and mock one particular person that people can easily look up and find who it is after using very violent language. And I'll say his name because he's spoken out on social media since this. He even updated his Twitter bio to say living rent-free in Elder Holland's head since 2019. So Matt Easton was a valedictorian at BYU in 2019, and he came out and said, I am a gay child of God, or I am a gay man, beloved, something like that. This speech was approved by proper channels. It was not him randomly coming out and trying to draw attention. He was talking about his life in context, just like anyone would, about what makes someone them. And I'd say Elder Holland has talked more about his sexuality than Matt Easton did, because every time Elder Holland talks about his wife, he's talking about his sexuality. And so to mock someone who's just saying, this is who I am, who went through proper channels, who was trying to be a voice for the voiceless, to give courage to the marginalized. Matt later went on Ellen and talked about him wearing an honor stole at graduation. Traditionally, you wear an honor stole to honor someone who helped you along your path, who that you then give that stole to afterwards to show honor to them. He talked about that he wore the honor stole in honor of a classmate who is gay, who died by suicide. And you mock him? That is not Christ-like behavior. I'll call that out.
Yes, for sure.
He's not even speaking the truth here, right? He's saying he
Yeah,
commandeered
it's a
the
lie.
whole.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a smear campaign against one individual who earned that spot on the who's a valedictorian.
Mhm. Again, provocative language, commandeer that's a heavy term. Again, he just said maybe we shouldn't use language to divide. And yet in the very next sentence, he's using very divisive, untrue, discrediting language. So there was no commandeering. This speech was vetted by BYU. And I also think that there's a slippery slope fallacy here, right? So if we allow this to happen, oh my goodness, what else could happen? And so assuming, like, again, instilling inappropriate fear, inappropriate concern.
And the slippery slope argument is, I think, particularly damaging to queer individuals because we've heard it before. If we allow queer same-sex marriages, what's next? Are you going to want to marry your dog? Going to want to marry a building? So the slippery slope argument is very hard for me. And so to have him use that was very difficult to hear.
And you absolutely pointed out the hypocrisy that heterosexual people get to talk about their experiences with marriage and sexuality and intimacy. And we don't say, oh my goodness, you're imposing your heterosexuality on the rest of us. And again, when he says intended to represent everyone, no, the graduation podium doesn't represent everyone. Every time he mentions his wife, he's not representing everyone, not to mention LGBTQ folks, but even single folks or people who aren't interested in getting married, or maybe people who have certain disabilities who that's not even an option for, And so again, it comes from this very privileged position that he doesn't even understand that what he is very comfortable saying and assumes that it just applies to everyone. We're consistently, as an audience, having to be spoken to by people who project their own individual values and lifestyles on us all the time. And minorities are in particular a threat of that causing mental, spiritual, and even physical harm. Okay, we got one more comment from Sean Aaron. I think this is when we were talking about the victim blaming. He says, getting people to coddle or empathize with those in power who cause harm at the expense of the people they are harming, despicable. And Anna Uceda says, I'm so pissed, we need outrage. And I agree. And Vicki Johnson says, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, let's move on to the rest of this. So again, as we mentioned with the abusive cycle, right? So there's been quite a bit of abuse that we've just went through, so abusive that I had a hard time even just reading it. So now let's get back to the honeymoon phase. In that spirit, let me go no farther before declaring unequivocally my love and that of my brethren for those who live with this same-sex challenge, which that's incredibly offensive already, to relegate this and minimize a person's identity and part of who they are as a person to a challenge, and to use language that has been unequivocally dropped by pretty much the entire world, which is this whole same-sex attraction to describe person's gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer identity. Okay, so he says, too often the world has been unkind, in many instances crushingly cruel. And I'm like, yes, Elder Holland, please look in the mirror. To these, our brothers and sisters. Like many of you, we have spent hours with them and wept and prayed and wept again in an effort to offer love and hope while keeping the gospel strong and the obedience to commandments evident in every individual life. So that's a conflict that unfortunately we as members of the church have to sit with. Our current doctrinal understandings and how we keep the commandments and how we think we are keeping the gospel strong is, in fact, in direct contradiction with the sexual, mental, spiritual health of a large portion of our population. There is no getting around that. So we cannot do both. We can't. It is impossible to state that you are being loving and caring and kind and continue to have interpretations of a certain understanding of God that keeps people oppressed and without ability to participate in the greater plan of happiness that the people of privilege get to benefit from. So any comments on just the hypocrisy of a lot of these statements and the conflict that we're sitting in right now in our community.
I mean, just to further underline what you already said, too often the world has been unkind, in many instances crushingly cruel. What about the church? The church, institutionally and what's currently understood, has caused much more pain than the world in regards to my sexuality.
Yeah. Your own community, not this outer thing.
I mean, again, another just like classic abusive tool to divert attention away from yourself and to say, out there is kind of the enemy, because if out there is the enemy, then you need somewhere to be protected. So we will protect you, and then you overlook all of the harm that's being done to you because you believe in some boogeyman out there that is going to be way more cruel to you. And so all of a sudden, the cruelty happening in the church is overlooked.
And it keeps those who are complicit with the church, in other words, those who agree, as not considering themselves abusers and cruel. It's like we can't really look at our own mirror and say, oh, I'm actually part of the problem. I'm actually the one hurting my daughter or my son or my friend when I support things like this and stand true to my leaders and obedience. So I think it is very difficult for any of us under any circumstances to take responsibility for our own bad behavior. And yet that's my invitation to all of us within the LDS community, is that we really need to look at how we are participating in an abusive system, how we are the abusers to this minority population. So he tries this really horrific honeymoon stance, which in of itself had some really problematic statements in it. And then he goes to the attack again. But it will assist everyone in providing such help if things can be kept in some proportion and balance in the process. For example, so in other words, we can be loving, but let's be careful how we're loving, right? So we have to be careful that love and empathy do not get interpreted as condoning and advocacy, or that orthodoxy and loyalty to principle not be interpreted as unkindness or disloyalty to people. He wants his cake and he wants to eat it too. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. As near as I can tell, Christ never once withheld his love from anyone, but he also never once said to anyone, because I love you, you are exempt from keeping my commandments. We are tasked with trying to strike that same sensitive, demanding balance in our lives.
What balance? This is something I've just struggled with in regards to this. And what I've had to come down to is I'd much rather err on the side of love. Like, why? Let me tell you, queer people know what the church's stance is. You do not ever need to remind them that you disagree with their lifestyle, and I'm putting that in air quotes. Why do you feel the need to continually preach to people who have already been kicked down? Why does there need to be a balance? Why can't we just love? That's my opinion anyways.
And to your point, Colette, if you think about of all of the speeches that could have been made when Nelson has come to BYU in the last few years, and Oaks, now Holland, of all the innovative topics they could have talked about, because BYU is impressive in the work that they're doing and some of the cutting edge research, especially like in their like mechanical engineering department, for example. Of all the things that we could be talking and addressing and exploring, and each of them chooses to come and talk about marriage and how marriage needs to be between a man and a woman. It feels very pointed and very redundant that this is what they choose to focus on, that the LGBTQ plus community just really needs to be held down.
Yeah, it is interesting when talking about balance, even if you want to stay true to your stance on this and say, we don't agree and we never will agree, why does it have to be a subject at every single general conference? Why does it have to be an address at every single BYU main event? Why does it have to be? There's so many other problems. There's so many other things we believe are sin, right? There are so many other human foibles and really problematic issues that we're facing. If I could hear as much about domestic violence as I hear about LGBTQ plus sin, maybe we could make some actual progress in the despicable abuses that are happening within Mormon families. How dare you talk about balance? This has been the most imbalanced aspect of speeches that I have seen ever in the history of my being a member of this church, ever since about the times that things started changing in regards to legalities in this country. That's when the balance went out of whack in regards to how much we're hearing about this particular population. But if we're so threatened about gay marriage destroying the sanctity of marriage, why can't we talk about marital rape destroying the sanctity of marriage? Why can't we talk about patriarchal dominion and abuse of children as destroying the sanctity of families and marriage? Why aren't we talking about issues that affect a much wider population and that actually does show harm? Because, sorry, the gay marriage issue, we can think of it as sin, but it's not holding up as any form of harm. They're better parents than heterosexual parents. They're having better egalitarian relationships in their marriages than heterosexual families and marriages are having. Like, the evidence doesn't support that gay marriage and gay people are somehow destroying the fabric of society. There's no research to provide that. We do have a lot of research of other sin that is destroying all kinds of lives. So where is the balance?
Yeah, as mental health professionals, we would tell you if we agreed that there were a problem with the gay marriage issue, air quotes again. Like Natasha said, we aren't seeing that. We see a lot of other problems. And this church, with its vast multi-billion-dollar resources, we actually could do a lot of good if we were to stop focusing on this issue and focus on some better ones.
And I keep looking at this comment he makes here of, I hope that loyalty to principle isn't interpreted as disloyalty to people. But in essence, what really is happening is that they are putting ideas and principles and policies over people. Like, that is what they are prioritizing. That is what they are asking people to do. That is literally what this whole talk is asking its members to do.
Yeah, it's like, don't be unkind as you watch me be unkind. So don't do naughty things, but we'll do naughty things and role model that to you. I mean, it's like the classic smoking parent, right? Don't smoke, kids, while I'm puffing on my cigarette. And we know that kids will probably more than likely follow your behavior versus your words. So this one little sentence, I mean, it's half of a sentence that he's saying in an entire speech of not being unkind, when in reality, the entire speech is unkind. And if you talk to queer people, this idea that we have as non-queer people, that you can be loving but not condone and not accept people, sorry, once again, it doesn't work that way. That's just basic tolerance. That is not love. So you can't tolerate people by disagreeing with their decisions, but it's not love. And love requires us to step outside of our current understandings and make room for other people's lived experiences, which I actually think is very aligned with the principles of the gospel. So therefore, again, how do we decide? Who gets to decide what gospel living is? Who gets to decide what these principles are? Who gets to decide what commandments we're talking about? The first two great commandments, or these arbitrary commandments that come from who knows where? And more than likely come from social stigmatization and discrimination practices, which we now understand colored a lot of our doctrinal understandings on a lot of other topics. Mm-hmm. And they themselves are saying that. So what's different now? Why wouldn't that be the case now? Yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say we can be loving and intolerant. And then the whole advocacy part. So Colette, I think out of all of us, well, maybe Michelle too, I think you're trained in social work. It is part of your ethical obligation to actually be advocates. It is part of educators' professional work to be advocates for their students, and especially minority students. Yep. So again, he's saying you in order to follow my idea of what gospel principles are, you have to be, completely a traitor to your own ethical and professional guidelines.
Which you can get into a lot of trouble for professionally if you don't follow your own ethics. I just want to point out that, again, we're using the word love, we're using the word empathy. We as mental health professionals understand that to mean unconditional love. Empathy means putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to get some idea of what their life is like and being open to that. He's not speaking to that. He's speaking of conditional love, which is not what Christ taught, as far as I remember.
Well, and Anna Yaseda says conditional love isn't love on our comments thread. But Colette, did I interrupt you?
Well, I just think of the quote, and I'm totally blank on the movie, but it's like, you're using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay. I love that.
Yeah. Who gets to define these terms, right? And when I read the New Testament, I get a pretty clear idea that love was fairly more expansive than our current understanding of that word. And in fact, a lot of the New Testament teachings are revolutionary in the historical times, right, of exactly what is happening. Religious leaders having very limited ideas of what needed to be done in order to comply with their doctrinal understandings of the time. And, this Jesus character, however you want to think of him, as divine or just a man, was revolutionary in the idea of saying, actually, there's something higher than your current understanding. And if that isn't at the basic basis of any Christian religion, then I think, there's you can't limit the gospel. You can't limit it. It's what makes Mormonism unique, is that we have this idea of continued understanding and revelation that implies we don't have all the answers. So why do we continue to stay attached to harmful rhetoric? I would prefer for them to take a more approach of like, we don't know, or this is our best understanding of the time, which they have said at times, instead of this hard lined, no, this is the way it is. This is what the doctrine can and cannot offer. These are the parameters you have to abide by. Sarah Huzabawa, who is one of our providers, she's commenting and saying, I think it's really important to recognize that there is no accountability for repair work to be done to Maddie. She's talking about the valedictorian. It is not okay that we mock marginalized members of the community that have done exceptional academic work and represented the university beautifully. When an organization will not do repair work for those they have hurt, it's important to look at that imbalance. Okay, so moving on, we're back to incendiary language. I guess it wasn't enough to mention arms, violent arms once. So here we go again. Musket fire. Yes, we will always need defenders of the faith, but friendly fire is a tragedy. And from time to time, the church, its leaders, and some of our colleagues within the university community have taken such fire on this campus. And sometimes it isn't friendly, wounding students and the parents of students who are confused about what so much recent flag waving and parade holding on this issue means. This is so frustrating because, again, wounding which students? Because these flag bearing people and parade holding people were students too. There were students of this university who went up and put lights on the Y to color it in rainbow colors. Those are students too, and they have parents too who are entrusting this university with their marginalized minority children who are at higher risk than privileged children.
And I just wanted to note, before all this went down, there's a group called the Rainbow Collective that's been planning a march and Pride Back to School night on September 4th at a park nearby the university. They're still planning on proceeding, even more so now, of showing support and eating, but they are also asking for donations to help pay for security because of this language. So I just wanted to note that. I do plan on going to that event because I think it's so important that we keep showing up. And if it confuses people, like Holland is saying, and wounding people, I'd much rather be wounding the people who are confused by the pride waving than wounding the gay and queer students and allies.
Yeah, which is a perfect lead up to what I was going to say, which was that I think back to last year and when they took that language out of the honor code, basically that then accidentally sent this message to queer students on campus that suddenly they could give expression to homosexual feelings, I think is the language. So basically telling them that this is okay, and that they're able to kind of live their lives more openly now. And how absolutely confusing that was until the director of the CES department came out and essentially said no, and we apologize, or didn't apologize, but basically said, no, that's not what we meant. So when I think about confusion, I think about that instance and the pain and the fear that ensued from that type of confusion. That feels a whole lot more significant to me than any kind of confusion that a student at BYU is just experiencing of what is the church's stance on this, who is not impacted at the level of safety. So it's just interesting that he uses that language here, that students are wounded by confusion, when that type of wounding last year is really what actually causes real issues.
And back to our ideas about critical thinking and enmeshment, really you're wounded by having to visit some different ideas that don't match your own. That's how fragile we are. I mean, aren't a lot of our people the ones who are talking about snowflake issues? What are our children snowflakes that they can't handle, different ideas and different lifestyles and different ways of looking at the world? This is what drives me bananas, right? It's just the hypocrisy of certain people who I know use certain language to critique certain people and then act so fragile and wounded when somebody doesn't agree with them. I would hope that our students are more resilient than that. And I hope that we could see confusion as welcome and critical thinking as welcome instead of friendly fire or wounding. In other words, what I'm seeing here is that if you're critical, if you have a different opinion, that's not welcome. It's considered friendly fire, which is incredibly, friendly fire can kill. I mean, people, it's a horrific thing that happens. It's again a term that is using a violent type of visualization, right? That if you're going to speak up, if I'm going to speak up, like I have and said, hey, there's members of our community that are struggling and I don't agree with this. And my mental health training lets me know that there's better ways to go about this. If that's seen as friendly fire because leaders are so fragile that, oh my goodness, that means I'm being attacked. How are we ever going to have dialogue or discussion that moves us anywhere? So yeah, if you're a confused and wounded parent or student who's white and straight, I'm not super concerned about you. I think that you can probably attend a few classes on diversity and you'll be just fine. You'll be just fine.
And might even serve you well. It'll serve you well.
Yeah, it will be okay. You'll be okay.
Because welcome to the world at large, which is very different than you.
Take a gender class. Most local universities offer them. Expand your view. It will not hurt you. And it will not brainwash you. You can still walk out of there with the same ideas that you've had. You can still be just as stubborn and not change any views. You'll be fine. And you do not deserve to be prioritized in the wounding of this community. Beloved friends, this kind of confusion and conflict ought not to be. Disagree. There are better ways to move towards crucially important goals in these very difficult matters. Again, I think we disagree on what crucially important goals are, because for me, that's safety. Ways that show empathy and understanding for everyone while maintaining loyalty to prophetic leadership and devotion to revealed doctrine. We kind of talked about that. There's a conflict there that is not sustainable. My brethren have made the case for the metaphor of musket fire. Again, I guess we've got to defend the violence, which I have endorsed yet again today, obviously. There will continue to be those who oppose our teachings, and with that will continue the need to define, document, and defend the faith. But we do all look forward to the day when we can beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. And at least on this subject, learn war no more. And while I have focused on this same-sex topic this morning more than I would have liked, I pray you will see it as emblematic of a lot of issues our students and community face in this complex contemporary world of ours.
I would invite him to learn war no more, not as a future goal, but maybe now.
Yes. This is again kind of playing the victim of we really don't want to be in this war, but we will participate in it if we have to. as if it's not of their choosing. And so it's really diverting the attention away, moving the blame elsewhere. And they're kind of just these victims of this war that they find themselves in that they have no control over.
Yeah, where's the war? Where's the war? Who's at war? What are the LGBTQ people doing to be at war? I mean, they're just trying to live their lives and have basic social justice rights. So who's creating the war here?
Right. And again, I've focused on the same-sex topic this morning more than I would have liked.
It's not my fault that I focused on it.
Right. No, like you had complete control over this talk, and it went through who knows how many edits and editors. You spoke the exact amount you wanted to. Don't play the victim.
Anna Yasuda says it should be stated that BYU approved Matt's speech prior to the ceremony. We did address that. Yes. And Cecilia Larkin-Weber says, it is my belief that someday the LGBTQI ban will be history, like polygamy and polyamory and the Black ban, 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road. What is your best guess this change will take place? Will it be for legal, monetary, or social issues that will bring about the revelation on embracing the LGBTQIA?
Money is what historically has made the change. Threat of losing, like with football, you know, them refusing to integrate or play different teams, that there's been speculation that helped to bring about the lifting of the temple and priesthood ban for Black individuals. Because even legally and socially, things are happening, and the church is claiming religious persecution and religious freedom and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know. I think it might come down to money, but how much when they have $100 billion in reserve? So that's my initial thought.
I don't have on that.
I mean, I have always said that the church will shift when they hit the tipping point of, you know, losing enough members and kind of seeing where things are going. But I don't know, like there are some days where I really think that, you know, I read this talk and I think this might be the mountain they've chosen to die on. And I don't know, I really don't.
Yeah, for me, it seems to me like it shifts for all of these reasons. And I think it shifts when it's really no longer tenable for us to stay within the very slight space of mainstream living. So not that we are in the middle of mainstream living. I mean, we're oftentimes flirting with fundamentalism in certain areas, but we're not willing, I think, to be completely fundamental as a church society. And so I think that when society moves so far ahead of us, that to stay behind would actually mean you'd have to kind of become fundamental. We want to stay just like on the other side of that fence and continue to be a strict religion versus a fundamental religion. And so I think that's happening at a faster rate. I mean, I do want to just note that the LGBTQ plus social justice kind of just timeline has exponentially gone forward in a fairly short amount of time, like in the last 10 to 15 years, in ways that I didn't think would happen in my lifetime. Like I remember thinking gay marriage, who knows if I'll ever even see that. And I'm only in my 40s, right? I remember in the 90s wondering, like, I don't think we'll ever see that. So things have really shifted very dramatically fast. I mean, if you remember, Obama himself said he would not support same-sex marriage, and then did within the end of his 8-year stance. And the country in of itself shifted dramatically in just a decade. So the church, I think, is having to deal with a shift that it's not used to at this rate.
And that's the tipping point, I think, that I was talking about, is like they're hitting it, they're really approaching it, and we'll see what they do. And in the past, we've seen that, yeah, they make the change that they need because they hit a crucial juncture where they don't want to lose members or money or whatever anymore. But who's to really say that this time that they'll continue to choose that they want to stay mainstream, or if they are going to move more in the direction of fundamentalism? Like, we really don't know.
Right. Yeah, so that remains to be seen. Right after he says, again, these kind of horrific things, he kind of again minimizes, but I digress. Oh, war, horribleness, disaster, but I digress. Let's go back to calmer things. So again, calming down the...
Again, let's recognize the cycle of abuse, saying these horrific things, and now going back into a honeymoon period where he's going to be talking about much nicer and kinder and loving things.
Back to the blessings of a school in Zion. And he goes on talking about how BYU has grown and spiritual strength and the number of people. So again, all this, very difficult rhetoric, and then now building it back up again. And I'm going to skip over some of this, but he then goes on. The next part that I want to address is he talks about President Kimball. And he says, President Kimball used the word unique 8 times in some address that he's quoting from, and special 8 times. It seems clear to me in my 73 years of loving it that BYU will become an educational Mount Everest. Grandiosity, only to the degree it embraces its uniqueness, its singularity. We could mimic every other university in the world until we got a bloody nose in the effort, and the world would still say, BYU who? No, we must have the will to stand alone, if necessary, being a university second to none in its role primarily as an undergraduate teaching institution that is unequivocally true to the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ in the process. If at a future time that mission means foregoing some professional affiliations and certifications, then so be it. There may come a day when the price we are asked to pay for such association is simply too high, too inconsistent with who we are. No one wants it to come to that, but if it does, we will pursue our own destiny, a destiny that is not a matter of chance, but largely a matter of choice. Not a thing to be waited for, but a thing to be envisioned and achieved.
I just can't believe he came out and said, if at a future time the mission means forgoing some professional affiliations and certifications, then so be it. There may come a day when the price we're asked to pay for such association is simply too high, too inconsistent with who we are. If we were to go down the slippery slope argument, what organizations would be gone? I graduated from BYU with both my bachelor's and my master's. I got my bachelor's from the School of Family Life, and I got my master's in social work. I think those would probably be gone because they're, he's specifically calling out these things that I studied as pushing agendas. If we're saying that gay marriage isn't a bad thing, if we're saying that we shouldn't advocate against principles and advocacy is part of my professional code of ethics, well, those programs are gone. Okay, so we'll let those go. What else would we be letting go? And I think we made a list of some ideas of what would go.
Yeah, we talked about this. Sarah Hughes-Zabawa was encouraging us to think about the implications for affiliations and accredited universities. That's a very important thing in regards to your own ability to provide for your family, to get a job, to be recruited. Who's going to want to recruit at a school that is bigoted and misogynistic and discriminatory? Again, many companies currently have mission statements and HR policies that do not allow for discrimination on any of these formats. So we had thought about, what about experts in civil justice, which affects the law school? You have experts in gender studies. There's a women's studies department at BYU. Of course, experts in any of the social science fields, which is also the marriage and family therapy program, as well as social work programs, School of Family Life. We also talked about experts in study of world religions and School of Religious Studies and theology, because they're moving away from, my understanding is that they're moving away from PhD theologians and instead just trying to have, again, just biased doctrinal understandings from Mormon Institute teachers type of, theological background, which is not diverse or robust in the world of academia. You've got the schools of anthropology that could be affected by this, definitely the schools of biology and certain hard sciences. I think School of Business will be largely affected mainly from just recruitment. And again, HR policies that are basic at this point at all parts of the United States, at least. and most European and first world countries, including actually quite a few second and third world countries, quite frankly. So many of the new tech companies and their mission statements are all about inclusion and diversity. This could affect progressive parts of engineering that will not be tolerated, especially when it comes to all kinds of medical implications. The School of Arts and Film, for sure, schools of theater, half of the students there are probably, identifying as LGBTQ plus. This affects not just current students and future students, but all of us who are alumni and graduated from what was considered an accredited school. And if we lose those accreditations, what does that mean for the value of our diplomas and the monies that we spent on higher education? So this is like incredibly disastrous in regards to our standing in the world. And I think it's also interesting, I don't know what particular name we would give to this, but it's interesting when a majority of people, like the majority are like, we think that the world needs to go in this direction, especially in social justice things. And people who do not want to go in that direction kind of have this persecution complex. We are the only ones who will hold true to the truth because everybody's moving forward. Like progressivism is seen as a bad thing, that only traditionalism is pure. And if you think about most things, there's people who would have thought that way about women being property. There's people who would have thought that thing about slavery, right? There's people who would think that about economic rights and social status. Most of the things that we look back on 300 years and think, wow, people did that. That was atrocious. The people in the conservative aspects held true. And as people were leaving them, they were like, but we are the only ones who are true. Like, that's a good thing? I don't think that's a good thing. I think this idea that we're being left alone and everybody's moving on ahead of us should be a clue that we may not be exactly where we should be. So why are we seeing that as a good thing?
Well, and further to talk about accreditation, I worked for a higher ed institution for several years. Accreditation is crucial in being able for students to provide money to go to a school. A school must be accredited to be able to receive FAFSA funds and federal financial aid for students to afford that. And let's also talk, yes, this address is being given at BYU. Please remember that there are other CES institutions. Yes, BYU is the flagship institution, but we have BYU Idaho, we have BYU Hawaii, we have Ensign, we have BYU Pathway, which feeds into either Ensign or BYU Idaho online. And this is so big because if he's saying this at BYU, what does it mean for the accreditation of all these other campuses and universities and all this faculty, staff, and students there? And all the alumni, all the future students. Where is this line going to be drawn and how many people are going to be hurt and wounded in the process?
And so much, I think, of BYU and all the affiliate schools, like their success has come from being integrated into the whole bigger, wider university system across the country and across the world. Like the whole, again, the world is our campus. There is strength that has come to them from being affiliated with other people. And going back to talking about abuse, an abuser will seek to isolate its victim from other people around them and other people who would give them feedback. And so if we're going to be cutting ourselves off from other groups that don't agree with us, then that further makes students at BYU vulnerable. And as Sarah was pointing out earlier today, we haven't really gotten to talk about this, but something that I think a lot of students among the Wasatch Front don't think about is that there are people coming from all over the world and all over the country and leaving their families of origin and their social networks. They're leaving their homes and they're coming onto this campus, sometimes not knowing anyone. They already are very vulnerable and very dependent on campus for their new social network and for support. And so to come in at the beginning of the school year, when this speech is made before the semester even begins, if they're made aware of something like this, which who knows if they are or not, but if they are, what a setting to walk into, already being vulnerable, And I'd imagine that students who are LGBTQ plus, and maybe are still figuring that out because they're at such a young age, are going to be shoved back into that closet so much more, because here is a setting where muskets are being discussed and where they are talking about disconnecting themselves from others, so that these students are becoming dependent on a community that's talking further and further about cutting themselves off from others.
Yeah, it's if you're all alone and nobody agrees with you and everybody's moving on to happier, healthier spaces, that's not really something to be super proud of. And I agree that, and it was Sarah Hughes-Zabawa who brought this up in our provider meeting earlier, that stage of life, 18, 19, 20, 21, is actually a stage of life in the mental health world where we know they're high risk for all kinds of issues that may, because if they had a stable home environment, people who are schizophrenic, people who may have bipolar, people who have borderline personality, they may have had enough of a bubble and a structure to keep those symptoms at bay. Whereas when they're in a completely new environment, whether it's the military, college, moving out on their own, we see an uptick of those kinds of diagnoses within that kind of young adult developmental stage. And so it's already a vulnerable population just from an age developmental stage setting, not to add, the intercomplexity of intersectionality of more complications that make you even more vulnerable, like being LGBTQ plus, being a minority as far as race or culture. The other thing that I wanted to bring up that Sarah mentioned was that we have people at BYU who come from countries where it is still very much, it's so discriminatory against LGBTQ plus people that you can be killed legally in their countries. And so to have, this kind of rhetoric continued at a university that could actually provide a safe haven from other situations that they're coming from that are very dire and very problematic is just a very missed opportunity, not to mention also creating another non-safe space to be at. So there's so many global implications. Again, I think oftentimes at BYU and in Utah, we talk as white people to other white people, and we talk as straight people to other straight people, instead of understanding the true diversity of the people who are within listening distance and influence.
And one thing I kind of heard from what Sarah was saying is we forget, because I've definitely heard the rhetoric of, well, if you don't want to follow the honor code, if you don't agree with church principles, don't come. Mm-hmm. And I think that discounts the fact that some students and potential students don't have a choice. There are parents who will only pay or only support someone in going to BYU for an education. There are individuals who this is the only thing they can afford to pay for because it actually is a somewhat reasonable tuition compared to other universities. May not have gotten into other universities, may not have applied to other ones. There's a people like myself who maybe didn't discover their sexuality before they went to college, and then they're in this situation. And what do you do now? Credits don't always transfer to other universities. BYU doesn't offer an associate's degree that transfers to other things. It's class by class. And if you get in trouble with the Honor Code office, they can withhold your ability to get your diploma. So don't discount and say, just go somewhere else. It's not that simple. We forget that not everyone that goes to BYU is a white, straight, cisgender individual from American Fork. There's a lot more diversity there and a lot of constraints for people's ability to go somewhere else.
And exactly to your point, Colette, it assumes that people know who they are at 18. A lot of what's happening during a college experience is you're figuring yourself out. You're exploring, you're thinking, you're trying things out. And that's actually very normative and actually a healthy part of human development. What you should be doing between the ages of 18 and 24, let's say, which is fairly typical for undergraduate age. And so to say, well, yeah, if you just don't like it, if you don't agree, go somewhere else. There's a lot of internalized homophobia due to this kind of community that we come from. There's a lot of internalized inability to really understand who you are. And there's not that permission being given to explore yourself. So we're expecting a lot out of an 18-and-a-half-year-old or a 19-year-old who their brains aren't even fully developed. They come from a very complex history. It's extremely challenging to expect a 19, 20-year-old young adult to know how to navigate this incredibly complex, non-affirming space, not to mention the familial, economic, and educational ramifications that keep people. I mean, I have several students that are clients of mine that are at BYU. They've faith transitioned, they're gay, they're whatever it is, but they're like, I'm 1 year away from graduating, so they're just trying to survive, and they can't really be themselves, and they feel, complicit, and they feel like duplicitous, and they feel like they're hiding a huge part of themselves. Like, what's that doing to their mental and spiritual health? And yet I understand their dilemma. I'm not necessarily saying, well, you should leave. I'm like, well, let's really weigh out the pros and cons, and what are the costs, and could you, in what ways, if you do decide to stay, can you self-care or find other community outside of BYU? I mean, these are the dilemmas that so many people are absolutely, it's not simple. And in fact, that's a form of abuse, is to diminish the complexity of a situation. So when people are like, well, just leave, just don't be a Mormon, just pick another university, or Holland didn't mean it, or it's belittling the complexity of the very myriad of factors that we've been discussing here today.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to say too, is it's incredible how often victims are blamed for not leaving their situation, and we do not consider all the different hurdles that they may face in leaving. One of the biggest being lack of access to other options. So, yeah.
And also not understanding that they're being abused.
Mm-hmm.
Because like Sarah also said, for a lot of these young adults, this is a beloved leader. This is somebody who they admire. This is somebody who they see as prophetic. This is somebody who they see as having so much authority and influence that it's directly tied to their connection to something as large and intense and all-encompassing as God. So that's why we felt it was important to go through and point out how these are tactics that humans fall into in controlling and having authority and being abusive, is because a lot of times you don't have the skills to even see what's happening to you. People in abusive systems usually take decades to get out of them. It's not because they're stupid. It's not because they're dumb. It's because when you're swimming in the water, you don't really know you're in water. It's just your lived experience. So it's, yeah, we want to help people understand and have options. So yeah, I'm just going to quote what Sarah said, which kind of, I tried to write down as much as she said, but she says, a lot of people forget that a large portion of students from BYU are from all over the world and all over the country. This is the first time away from their primary support systems. Take somebody who is closeted, first week of school, they don't have an intrinsic support system or the emotional developmental skills, maybe barely coming out to themselves. Now they have to face peers who they have just met who are talking about intrinsic homophobia narratives. Maybe their parents will only pay for BYU. There's limitations to their situations, and they may not have the ability to transfer. They're afraid, they're alone, they don't know where to go. And not only that, this is a disservice to the straight privileged kids who are coming into a system that, instead of helping them challenge and be more socially justice minded, just continues to infiltrate homophobic and bigoted ideas. And some of these kids actually come from fairly progressive Mormon families, but they can actually, get more indoctrinated and orthodox because of what they're hearing leaders like this say. And of course, if they come from Orthodox families, they're more than likely to then become the bullies, the unkind people, the people who don't treat other people well, because we're encouraging them to. You can't say, oh, be kind, when I just taught you 500 ways to not be kind, and plus get a musket thing going on. Julie Rosa says, Wilford Woodruff said about polygamy that they would give up the temples and all the property, but eventually they did find a revelation to change their policy. I think it will be the same.
Mm.
Yeah, we've said a lot of kind of ridiculous things, quite frankly. Okay, let's maybe, is there anything else that either one of you want to say in regards to the talk before we move into maybe some resources, some ways to maybe be self-coping or community coping, etc.
I'm excited to talk about resources, but before we do that, I just want to end by saying, if you were hurt by this, I will validate and see that pain. And you are not crazy for feeling that. And if you're seeing in your social media, people standing up, I get how hurtful that is. And maybe you do feel a little gaslit of, but I hope by us pointing out these abusive language, tactics, words, that you feel a little more justified in whatever hurt or confusion or pain you've been feeling this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd echo that as well. And I think as we started talking about this, like, abuse is a very complex thing. It's a mix, and it often shows up in people who are a complex mix of better and not so good traits, as we all are. Like, life is complex and it's messy. And when we try to oversimplify things and try to throw people into categories of all good or all bad, we do ourselves a disservice. And so I think this is it's a hard topic to talk about somebody's abusive behavior when you want to perceive him as somebody who is wonderful in all ways. And so I respect that process. I think it's a painful one and a confusing one, but one that sometimes you need to trudge through. So.
And I just want to review some of the terms, just because I don't know that we hit them all, but all of these can be found within this talk. So we had criticism, we had mocking, we had maligning, we had mischaracterizations, we had insidiatory language that hate crimes are directly correlated with. We have tone deafness. Yeah, tone deafness and insensitivity. We have an attack on diversity, which actually is not proven from a research perspective. Diversity training actually leads to inclusion and harmony versus divisiveness. There's definitely playing the victim, which, by the way, a quote I got from a psychology article says victim abusers usually portray themselves as innocent, hurt, blameless, wounded souls caught up innocently in the poor behavior of another person or circumstance. Victims are very self-centered, and when in relationships are only capable of seeing their own hurt, even if it's fabricated. So this is like victim players. I mean, victim players, not victims. Victim players do not care about the feelings of others, showing a complete lack of empathy. So we can see a lot, we've talked a lot about that. Like, we are the victims instead of actually who the population is here, who's actually the victims. Victim players frequently feel sorry for themselves, even if they cause the problems in the relationships. They don't see this reality and they feel victimized as they cause the problems. Provocative language, which incites violence. Incite comes from a Latin verb meaning to move into action. And if you incite someone to do something, that is exactly how to describe it. We used the term gaslighting, love bombing. We talked about abuse cycle. We talked about veiled threats, how indirect language, passive aggressive language was used. Let's see, blaming the actual victim, so victim blaming, othering, slippery slope fallacies, minimizing, which is representing or estimating at less than the true value or importance, belittling, trivializing, discrediting, condemning advocacy, which is just really horrific for any social health issue, homophobia, using humor as part of the gaslighting process. So these little quips and jokes that are meant to lighten the mood when actually what's being said is fairly horrific. And then if people say they are hurt by that, they are seen as oversensitive. So again, that's another way of victim blaming. Hero worship, when you can't complicate a person to be able to see the good and bad. So we black and white heroes, and not able to criticize words or actions. We talked about intent versus impact. Cognitive dissonance, and it's important to note that people resolve cognitive dissonance by devaluing. One way that people resolve cognitive dissonance is by devaluing and discarding conflicting knowledge. So please be aware of this in yourself. So you may limit your exposure to new information that does not align with your existing beliefs. That's a human phenomenon, and that's called confirmation bias. So if a woman reads that her favorite politician has done something immoral, she could conclude that the charges have been invented by his enemies, or instead rethink her support. So you have to do one or the other. You have to either defend or you have to rethink. And oftentimes it's much easier to defend what you already agree with. Dual relationships, we talked about that. So the role of playing two roles at the same time, which is oftentimes inappropriate in academic settings and ecclesiastical settings. We talked about double speak. Okay, I think that's all the words that we used.
Quite the list. So what do we do from here? I am excited for this part of the conversation. I always want to make people aware of resources. If this has brought up any suicidal thoughts or ideation, please know that there is help available. If you already have a therapist, reach out to them, be talking to them, have them be a resource. Hopefully you do have community support, friends and family. But if not, there of course is the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and that's at 1-800-273-TALK. You can also text TALK to 741-741 to text with a trained counselor from the crisis text line. There's the Trevor Project, specifically for queer individuals and topics. You can call at 1-866-488-7386 or text Trevor to 202-304-1200, or even chat online. So those are a few resources just to be aware of off the top of your head when we are talking about these sort of issues.
I would also say that for those who are at BYU, I have had nothing but positive experiences with the BYU Counseling Center. They are very apt and adept and keep everything confidential. Nothing is shared with the Honor Code or the Honor Code Office in regards to any type of services that you might seek. And they are what I would consider LGBT affirming. They're not going to try any types of conversion therapy or encourage you not to identify as you would identify in your own authenticity. So they are a resource. There are also other resources. There's a nonprofit organization called Flourish, run by Lisa Hansen. I always forget her mixed last name, Lisa Hansen, I'll say that. They do a phenomenal job of offering services. There is an End Circle home in Provo, Utah. Every community should have, every major community, fairly major community should have a Pride Center, even if it's small, and they will have lots of resources and you can walk in there, catch an Uber or take a bus if your university or area isn't close to one, and go talk to somebody there, and they can allude you to whatever local resources you may have in your community. Telehealth has really widely expanded through COVID. So even if you don't have necessarily a therapist or a counselor who could work with you in a locally small community, for example, that is LGBTQ affirming, there are many within your state that could do in-state teletherapy. And of course, there are some services that even a coach or consultation could provide, regardless of where you are geographically. We at Symmetry Solutions, of course, offer therapy, coaching, and consultations. We offer also ecclesiastical consultations for bishops, Relief Society presidents, young women's or young men's presidents who need a 1-hour free consultation in regards to any concern that may be happening in your ward or stake where you're concerned about a member maybe having issues, being suicidal, having family ostracization issues, how to help your ward be more affirming in light of many recent events. We also have there are lots of social media groups where you can either just kind of look and not really participate, but at least get some support by seeing what other people write, or get quite actively involved. There is the group Affirmation. It's an LDS-centered group for people who are LGBTQ+, who are in mixed orientation marriages, who are in college, who are out, who are not out, who want to leave the church, who don't want to leave the church. So they're a very, very good resource, and you can find them at affirmation.org.
And Affirmation does have a free virtual conference upcoming in September. And so that can be a great thing that anyone can register to attend. They even have specific ones for church leaders. And this year it's free, so go to that. I also wanted to add, I did mention the Rainbow Collective earlier. That can be a good resource if you are a BYU student and want to gather with some other ones this upcoming Saturday, not this Saturday, the Saturday after Saturday, September 4th. The Out Foundation, if you are a BYU student, has been raising money if people need help transferring to other universities because they no longer feel safe, or they can also help pay for therapy. They have partnered with Flourish that was mentioned earlier. If you're in Utah, there is the LGBTQ Affirmative Therapists Guild of Utah, which can be a great resource to know that these therapists have received specific training about LGBTQ affirmative therapy and will not do anything anywhere near conversion therapy as well. So those are a few more ones that jump to mind as Natasha was talking.
There's also the national organization, ASECT, American Association for Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and you can find them at aasect.org. They also have a therapist provider list according to United States, possibly also Canada, I believe. And those are all people who are trained in sexuality and trained in also, of course, LGBTQ affirming services. So if you don't, you can also call your insurance companies if you have insurance and ask specifically for LGBTQ plus affirming services, because a lot of times therapists will click those kind of boxes and say they're willing to work with those kinds of populations versus just getting a general practitioner.
Yeah, the only thing I would add about the OUT Foundation is that they have partnered with Flourish Therapy to provide subsidized and free therapy. And so that's one great resource, because I know a lot of times it can feel overwhelming to feel like you need additional support, but don't have the financial resources. So
we also have 2 free groups going on right now through Symmetry Solutions. So on Tuesday nights, for those who feel like they're going through a faith transition or having issues within the LDS church, we have an online group at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Our provider, Lindsay Hyde, runs that. And we currently have an in-office, in-person group as well on Thursday nights, 7 p.m. as well, Mountain Standard Time in the Holiday, Utah area. You can get more information about those on our website, symmetrysouls.com, or like I said, getmormonhelp.com. And those are donation based. Like if you want to donate and help pay the providers who are there, great. But if you can't afford to, no problem, just come. So I think, those are all resources, right? I think as far as just mental health ideas, spiritual health ideas, I think it's just, there's several thoughts I have. One is that this isn't the only Mormon guy. There's a lot of us who identify as Mormon, who maybe no longer identify as Mormon, but care deeply about the Mormon community. There are many of us who, if you haven't picked up a copy of Blair Osler's Queer Theology, is that the name of it? I'm trying to think.
Queer Mormon Theology.
Queer Mormon Theology. It's phenomenal. It's like taking your Mormonism and making it into something that is palatable and that is possibly a spiritual match for you if your religion and your faith is still important, right? And you want to enjoy the benefits of being LDS or being a Mormon person. If for whatever reasons you're no longer finding the Mormon church a safe space for you and you're needing to take a break, you can do that in lots of different ways. A lot of people start with what we call a sabbatical. You don't necessarily have to make any major life decisions like I will leave and I will resign and I will never be back. You can just take a break, take a breather, see what it feels like not to attend church for a few months. Or I know that if you're a BYU student, you may not be able to do that, but you can, in a sense, maybe compartmentalize a little bit in your own mind. Like I'm willing to go and listen and adhere to certain things, but things that I find harmful, I'm going to put aside and not listen to those things as much. People do end up deciding that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not a good, healthy spiritual home for their well-being, and that's very understandable. And from a mental health perspective, it's actually supported because affirming places we know do up your risk for suicide and for a lot of other mental health concerns and conditions. So if you are going to go through a faith transition, there's lots of resources to be able to faith transition well. A Gift of a Mormon Faith Crisis is one that I've been intimately involved with John and Margie DeLynn, and offers a lot of ideas about how you can talk to your family and how you can deal with the sadness and the grief and the anger and the myriad of feelings that come from having to shift and identify in very different ways than you're used to identifying and not having the community support that maybe you were once used to. So I think that one is just knowing that people are love you, support you, and don't agree with Elder Holland right within our circle of people. Then, of course, there's a huge, larger circle of people outside of our church who also agree that this is not the best place for you and who want to help and who want to, help you find better spaces. The It Gets Better Project is a good thing to watch. Some of those videos, which is kind of the Trevor Project. I think that also really honing into what can you control? What is in your control? What do I want to listen to? What do I want to believe? What do I want to place energy in, or what do I not want to place energy in? Finding community, finding support groups or friends or resources that aren't just like, I mean, a lot of the resources we talked about are kind of like grander resources, but I'm talking about like day-to-day resources, right? Like, who are the 2 or 3 people in your life who you can count on, who you can go to, who are a phone call away, and can you let them know that maybe you're struggling, and make sure that you're counting on people who are affirming of you. Michelle, what other thoughts do you have?
Yeah, I would just add that, and I know I kind of keep bringing this up throughout this, but I really want to drive it home that it can feel incredibly uncomfortable to start turning around and not blaming things on yourself and starting to hold other people accountable. That can feel incredibly uncomfortable. And especially, I think, within Mormonism, a lot of times we are so accustomed to the idea that if there is an issue, if I am struggling with the church, it is all my fault and I need to change my own behavior. And so there isn't much room a lot of times for holding other people accountable. So I understand that this process can feel uncomfortable. This whole talk session that we've had right now could maybe feel uncomfortable to you, but this is a part of kind of the growing process of it's kind of a developmental process that we need to go through in order to really protect ourselves. Like, it is okay to protect yourself. As social workers and as mental health providers, we are trained that the one thing they kind of drill into our minds is safety first. Like, at all costs, safety first. And once that is established, then you can move forward in all these other difficult, sticky situations. And so I would hope that if you're listening to this and if you are hesitant to kind of hold Elder Holland accountable for some of the things that he has said, these incredibly damaging things that he has said, to just sit with it for a while and recognize that you have every right in the world to look at someone else and ask if they are causing damage in some way. And again, that doesn't have to make them into an entirely terrible person. That doesn't define their whole being, but it allows you to give space for that one area where they did act inappropriately. And so I just understand that this can feel new and bizarre and maybe uncomfortable, and that's okay.
If you're a parent, an LGBTQ plus person, you should also know about the Mama Dragons and Papa Dragons organizations. They have a very diverse, robust Facebook group, resources, again, lots of different ways that you can advocate that way. I'm not sure, did we mention Trans Lifeline as well? That's 1-877-565-8860, as well as PFLAG. I believe it's pflag.org, that for parents and for parents of trans folks and transgender individuals, are a lot of great resources there. So I think also, kind of going along with what Michelle was saying, is that we've talked about complex trauma, and maybe some people don't really know what that means. Complex trauma means that there's several factors happening at the same time and consistently. So, a one-time trauma could be like, I'm in a car accident, right? And it happens this one time, and I have to deal with the ramifications and the fear and the aftermath of that one event. And it was traumatic, and it has implications for my day-to-day life for a variety of, time frames. Complex trauma is oftentimes referring to something that's happening on an ongoing basis. And we did talk about how this has unfortunately been a repetitive dynamic and pattern is for leaders of the LDS Church to be quite vitriolic and insensitive in regards to the needs of the LGBTQ plus population. So this is like time after time after time. And it's not just the leaders, because then now your mother or your grandmother or your friend or your educational institution or your teacher or your school system or whatever, it has these ripple effects in your life. And so that's why it has such a much larger implication for people and can oftentimes be so much more difficult to manage. And why we see the statistics that we consistently talk about, right? Those statistics don't just happen out of nowhere. So people can only handle so much stress, right? So much bullying, so much attack, so much, marginalization and discrimination before there are some very serious implications. So, and what we notice with complex trauma is that sometimes people react very strongly right at first. But what you might also notice is that you don't really notice your reaction until a week or two after an event like this. And that's really normal too. Like you may feel fairly numb or like, that doesn't matter. I don't care about that anymore. But then you might find yourself irritable or depressed or hopeless, a week or two from now, not really understand why, like not putting those points together. But when you're dealing with complex trauma, those things can be related. And it's important for you to just kind of be kind to yourself and gracious and understand that, this may have some ripple effects for a while. And sadly, unfortunately, by the time that I maybe recover a little bit, General Conference is right around the corner and you'll probably have some more ripple effects, right? So I'm just really concerned for you and for your ability to manage so much of this consistent messaging that is coming at you or your loved ones.
Yeah.
I do. Go ahead, Michelle.
I was going to say, which is why we just shared such an ample amount of resources, because if there's anything that will help protect people from abuse, it's surrounding yourself with support and surrounding yourself with people who are going to tell you, I hear you, I see you, you're not crazy, and you are not alone in this. It is so important to not face this alone.
And you are worthy, and you are spiritual. You are a sexual, sensual, complex being that has a right to be so without feeling like you're somehow being evil or not following a commandment or not being aligned with things that may really be very spiritually of value to you. So there's divinity within you, right? And for people to, in the name of God, challenge that is extremely inappropriate and damaging. So I think it's just important for you to know that there are many of us who see your divinity, see your worth, regardless of how you orient, who you kiss, who you date, who you're thinking about in your fantasies, and who you're marrying and who you're being sexual with, right? So that's, I think, really important to start integrating those ideas if you haven't yet been able to. And even if you have, it's still painful when other people don't respect that, divinity and worthiness within you. So I think that things that those of us who are allies or parents can do, I think we should all be writing letters or calling Brigham Young University, especially for alumni. I think that we can also, if you're still active members in the church, be very mindful about what's being said and what's being allowed in ward congregations, being a person who's willing to raise their hands and say, hey, we need to be careful how we're speaking here. There's people among us that we're talking about, and calling people, inappropriate behavior and comments out at church is super important. I'm always super in awe and grateful for people who are willing to be those people who stand in those very difficult spaces in their own church communities. Some people just wear symbols that signal I'm safe. I know a lot of people wear rainbow ties, some people wear rainbow pins, some people wear mama dragon pins to church and things like that, signaling that, hey, I'm here, because you never know who is out and who is struggling in any congregation. I think sometimes people think, oh yeah, if there's somebody who's gay, we would know it, right? They would be acting a certain way, or they'd be presenting in a certain way, or they'd be, disagreeing with everybody. No, a lot of times the gay queer person is the quiet, most, conformist person in the ward environment, but internally are having an incredibly difficult struggle. So sometimes signaling that you're an ally can be incredibly beneficial, even if they never approach you. Just knowing that somebody's there with that pin on their label or whatever is can be incredibly helpful for people. You can donate to causes, right? Donate to these nonprofits. We're always more than willing to take donations. I'm still working on a nonprofit arm of Symmetry Solutions, but if you want to send us donations so that I can pay my providers a discounted rate to see people pro bono, we are more than willing to do that, and we'll use 100% of your monies to do that. There's lots of other organizations that you can donate to. And just speaking up. Don't allow comments in your family systems that are discriminatory. Don't allow jokes that are discriminatory. Be willing to kindly call people out in your own inner circles. Talk to your kids. Don't assume your kids are straight. Make room for a lot of conversation and discussion and whatever, and circles of influence you may have. Get your own help. Sometimes if you're a mother or a father, I know I have a queer kid, it's incredibly difficult to see your kid be harmed, right? So get your own help. Anything else, Michelle?
No, I think that's all. You've said it.
Okay. Let's all try to walk with each other and take care of each other in times of great pain and distress. I think last night in our group, one of the members said there's beauty in pain. And I think what they meant was that there's beauty in how they were feeling supported by a community that held space for them while they were in severe pain. And there is beauty in that. There's beauty in how we are able to come to each other's aids. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Colette, for being with us today, even though we were all in and out. I know people had appointments and things, but we knew this would be a much longer session than we normally do for our 20-minute, kind of Symmetry Live time that we do on Fridays. So, and thanks for all of you who have hung in there. Please feel free to contact us if you have any other questions. We're going to try to put a lot of these resources we just talked on the threads so that you'll have access to those as well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me, unknown way before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Her child, thou canst touch the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous way, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore and the field betwixt me and the peaceful rest. Then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,